Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I was home alone that night. My roommate was out of town visiting her family, so it was just me. It wasn't a big deal, I'd spent plenty of nights alone before. I actually liked the quiet sometimes. I had dinner, watched some TV, and was about to head to bed when I heard a knock at the door. It was almost 9 p.m., too late for deliveries. I wasn't expecting anyone. My stomach tightened a little, but I told myself it was probably just a neighbor or someone dropping off a package for the wrong address. I walked to the door and looked through the peephole. A man stood there in a delivery uniform, holding a small package. Brown polo shirt, dark pants. No logo on the shirt, but it looked official enough at first glance. He wasn't carrying a company-branded bag or anything, just a package in one hand. I hesitated. He knocked again, a little louder this time. Then he took a step back and looked around, like he was checking if anyone else was nearby. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called out through it, keeping my voice steady. "Hello?" He stepped closer again. "Package for you," he said. His voice was deep, but there was something off about the way he spoke, like he wasn't used to saying it. Like he was rehearsing. I didn't order anything. "Who's it from?" I asked. He hesitated. "It's from, shipping center," he said. That wasn't an answer. I looked down at the package in his hand. There was no label. Just a plain, brown box. No barcode. No shipping company logo. I felt my heart start to beat a little faster. "I think you have the wrong house," I said. He didn't move. "You're my address, right?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. My stomach dropped. He shouldn't have known that. I took a step back from the door, my mind racing. I didn't want him to know I was nervous. "I didn't order anything," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he exhaled, like he was annoyed. "Well, someone at this address did." I stayed silent. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "You gonna open the door?" "No," I said. Another pause. Then he let out a low chuckle. It wasn't friendly. "You don't trust me?" he asked. I didn't answer. His eyes flicked to the windows. I saw his body lean slightly, like he was trying to peek inside. I moved quickly, grabbing my phone off the counter. I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. My hands were shaking. "You live alone?" he asked suddenly. I felt like my blood turned to ice. I didn't respond. I backed away from the door completely, moving toward the kitchen where I had a knife in the drawer. There was silence on the other side of the door. No footsteps. No movement. Just heavy, lingering quiet. Then, I heard the doorknob jiggle. I hit call. The moment I pressed the button, I heard him step back. "Fine," he muttered. "Suit yourself." I heard footsteps moving away from the door. The dispatcher answered. I whispered into the phone what was happening, keeping my voice as low as possible. I didn't want him to hear me. "Stay on the line," she said. I moved to the window slowly, pulling back the curtain just enough to see. The man was still there. He hadn't left. He was standing in my driveway, looking at my house. His head tilted slightly, like he was thinking. Then, after a few seconds, he turned and walked toward a white van parked across the street. No logo. No company name. Just a plain, unmarked van. He got in the driver's seat, but he didn't leave right away. He just sat there. "They're on their way," the dispatcher said in my ear. I kept watching the van. My fingers gripped the curtains so tightly my knuckles ached. After what felt like forever, the red and blue lights appeared down the street. The second the sirens got close, the van's engine started. It pulled away fast, disappearing around the corner just as the police arrived. The officers checked the area but didn't find anything. They took my statement, asked for a description, told me I did the right thing by not opening the door. One of them said there had been similar reports in other neighborhoods, men posing as delivery drivers, trying to get inside homes. They never caught him. I don't answer my door at night anymore. I was dead tired when my shift ended. It was one of those long, dragging nights where time barely moved, and by the time I clocked out, my body felt heavy. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a few cars scattered under the dull glow of the streetlights. Mine was parked near the far end, where the lights didn't quite reach, making the inside of my car look like a dark cave. I unlocked the door, got in, and let out a long breath. I just wanted to get home. The air inside the car was stale, and the cold leather seat made me shiver. I started the engine, and the dashboard lights flickered on, casting a weak glow over the interior. I adjusted the rearview mirror out of habit. That's when I saw him. A man was sitting in my back seat, completely still, smiling at me. I froze. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. He was just there, in the shadows, his face barely illuminated by the dim lights from the dashboard. His smile was wide, too wide, like he'd been sitting there, waiting for me to notice. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My hands were still on the steering wheel, my foot hovering over the brake. Every instinct screamed at me to get out, but my body wouldn't respond. The man didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at me through the mirror, his head tilted slightly, like he was amused by my reaction. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I forced myself to think. The door. I needed to open the door. I needed to run. Slowly, without taking my eyes off the mirror, I moved my hand toward the door handle. But before I could pull it, the man in the back seat leaned forward, just slightly. "You're not going home yet," he said, voice low, almost playful. That was it. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I threw the door open and launched myself out of the car, hitting the pavement hard. My knee scraped against the asphalt, but I barely felt it. I scrambled to my feet and spun around, expecting him to come after me. But he didn't. He was still sitting there, still smiling. The overhead light inside the car should have turned on when I opened the door, but it didn't. The darkness in the car made his features even harder to make out. I reached into my pocket with shaking hands and fumbled for my phone. I could barely hold onto it. My fingers were clumsy, slick with sweat. I dialed 911 and pressed the phone to my ear, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The dispatcher answered. "I need help," I whispered, my voice barely working. "There's a man in my car. He's in my car." I turned back to the car. The back seat was empty. I stood there, gripping my phone, my whole body shaking. The door was still open. The car was still running. But there was no one inside. The dispatcher kept asking me questions, but I barely heard them. I stepped closer, just enough to peek inside, to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. Nothing. No sign that anyone had ever been there. I felt like I was losing my mind. I had seen him. I knew I had seen him. The police arrived a few minutes later. They checked my car, the parking lot, everything. There was nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the dirt outside my car. Nothing was stolen. One of the officers asked if I might have fallen asleep in my car before driving off, maybe had a bad dream. I wanted to argue, but I didn't. Because what else could I say? They left after making sure I was okay. I got back into my car, locking the doors this time, and drove home with my hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. I kept checking the mirror the entire way. I don't park in that lot anymore. I don't sit in my car for long. And I always check my back seat before getting in. Because I know what I saw. And I know he was real. I was desperate for a job. I had bills piling up, and the job market wasn't great, so I started applying to anything that seemed halfway decent. That's how I found the listing. It was for an administrative assistant position, nothing glamorous, just basic office work. The pay was better than minimum wage, and they didn't require a ton of experience, so I applied. I got an email the next day from someone named Richard. He said he was impressed with my resume and wanted to set up an interview. That should have been my first red flag. No phone screening, no long application process, just an immediate invite. But I wasn't in a position to be picky. The address he gave me was for a small office in an older building on the outskirts of town. I looked it up and saw that it wasn't attached to any well-known company, but I figured maybe it was a startup or a private firm. When I pulled into the parking lot, the building itself looked fine, nothing run down, just quiet. A little too quiet. I walked in and immediately noticed how empty it was. There was no front desk, no receptionist, no signs with company logos. Just a dimly lit hallway with a few doors. The kind of place where you could hear your own footsteps a little too clearly. One of the doors had a piece of paper taped to it that said "Interviews, Room 3" in plain black font. Something about it felt off. Most businesses have official signage, not a flimsy piece of paper taped to the door like an afterthought. I hesitated but knocked anyway. A man opened the door almost immediately. He was in his mid-40s, dressed in a button-down shirt and slacks, but something about the way he carried himself made me uncomfortable. He smiled a little too wide, like he'd been expecting me. "You must be Emily," he said. I forced a smile and nodded. "Come in," he said, stepping aside. I walked in, and the first thing I noticed was how bare the room was. Just a table, 2 chairs, and a file folder sitting in the middle. No computers, no office decorations, nothing that made it look like a real workspace. The walls were plain white, the kind of white that makes a room feel smaller than it is. The moment I stepped inside, I heard the click of the door locking behind me. I turned around. Richard was standing by the door, still smiling, but his hand was resting on the lock. I swallowed hard. "Why did you lock the door?" "It's just a security measure," he said. "We don't want interruptions." I didn't like that answer. He gestured toward the chair. "Have a seat." I hesitated, but I sat down. Every part of me was on edge. He sat across from me and opened the folder, flipping through a few pages that looked completely blank. I could feel my pulse in my throat. "So," he said, looking up, "I have to be honest with you, Emily. The job description online was a little misleading. I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "We're looking for someone a little more flexible than just an office assistant." I pushed my chair back an inch. "I don't understand." He smiled again, and I hated how calm he looked. "You're a smart girl." "I think you do." My hands clenched into fists under the table. The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. "I'm not interested," I said, standing up. Richard didn't move. "Sit down," he said, still smiling. "I'm leaving," I said, reaching for the door handle. It didn't budge. "I don't think you understand," he said, his voice lower now. "You're not leaving until we finish this conversation." I turned around, my heart pounding. He was still sitting there, watching me like he had all the time in the world. I reached into my bag, fumbling for my phone. Richard sighed and leaned back. "If you make this difficult, I promise you won't like how it ends." I didn't wait to hear anything else. I grabbed the closest thing I could, a heavy glass paperweight from the table, and threw it at him as hard as I could. He ducked, cursing, and I used that second to yank at the door handle again. This time, it gave just enough that I could wedge my foot against the wall and pull harder. I heard Richard stand up behind me, but before he could grab me, I threw myself against the door, forcing it open. I stumbled into the hallway, almost falling, and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop running until I was outside and in my car with the doors locked. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely start the engine. I drove straight to the police station. They went back to check the office, but when they got there, the room was empty. No table, no chairs, no folder. Just a plain white room with no evidence that anyone had been there. The email I'd gotten from Richard was deleted. The job listing was gone. They told me they'd investigate, but I knew they wouldn't find anything. I changed my phone number. I stopped applying to jobs online for a while. I don't go anywhere alone anymore. And I always check that the door doesn't lock behind me. It was past midnight when I pulled into the gas station. The roads had been empty for miles, and I was starting to feel the kind of exhaustion that makes your body feel heavier than it is. I just needed gas. Fill up, get back on the road, and make it home. The station was one of those rundown, off-the-highway places with bad lighting and a flickering sign that barely looked open. The kind where the convenience store had a single person working behind the counter who didn't care if you walked in or not. I parked at the pump closest to the exit. The station was nearly empty, except for one other car parked off to the side. A dark-colored sedan, older model. I didn't think much of it at first. I got out, swiped my card, started pumping gas. That's when I noticed him. A man stood on the other side of the station near the sedan. He wasn't getting gas. He wasn't smoking. He wasn't even pretending to be doing something. He was just standing there, facing my direction, watching me. At first, I thought maybe he was looking past me, zoning out or lost in thought. But the longer I stood there, the more I realized he wasn't blinking. Not once. Just standing unnaturally still, eyes locked on me. I glanced away, tried to ignore it. My stomach had started to tighten, but I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe he was waiting for someone inside. Maybe he was just weird. I kept an eye on the numbers ticking up on the pump, willing them to go faster. But when I looked back, he had moved. Not toward me, but just slightly. A shift in position, like he wanted me to know he was still there. Like he was letting me know he saw me looking. His expression hadn't changed. His hands were hanging at his sides, his face blank. I focused on the pump, my heartbeat picking up. The numbers couldn't go fast enough. Then I heard footsteps. Not coming toward me. Just moving. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing behind his car. Not leaving, not approaching. Just letting me hear them. I yanked the nozzle out of my tank, not even waiting for the last few cents to finish. I screwed the cap back on with shaking hands and got into my car, locking the doors the second I was inside. I looked back toward where he had been standing. He was gone. The sedan was still there, but he wasn't next to it anymore. I scanned the lot, my pulse hammering, trying to figure out where he had moved to. Then I saw him. He was sitting in the driver's seat of the sedan, hands on the wheel, still staring straight ahead. Still not blinking. I turned on my engine, my hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. I backed out slowly, not wanting to look like I was rushing. Not wanting to give him a reason to follow me. As I pulled out onto the road, I checked my rearview mirror. The sedan's headlights flicked on. It pulled out of the lot. My mouth went dry. I told myself it was a coincidence. Maybe he was just leaving at the same time. Maybe he had been waiting for someone, and they never showed up. I tried to convince myself of anything that made sense. But when I turned onto the main road, so did he. When I changed lanes, so did he. When I sped up, so did he. The tightness in my chest turned into something worse. I made another turn, taking a road that wasn't the direct route home. He followed. I took another turn. He followed. At this point, I wasn't even trying to pretend it was a coincidence. My breathing was coming faster, my knuckles white against the wheel. I needed to lose him. I took another turn this time, fast. Not even signaling. I made another one right after that, cutting down a side street, trying to get some distance. When I glanced in the mirror, I didn't see him. I kept driving, not slowing down. I took a few more random turns, made sure I was far from where I had been. Then, finally, I let myself breathe. I told myself I had lost him. But then I reached a red light, and the sedan pulled up right behind me. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my fingers ached. He had followed me the whole way, never losing me, never making a move. Just trailing, just watching. The light turned green. I floored it. I wasn't going home. I wasn't leading him anywhere near where I lived. I needed people, witnesses, somewhere public. I spotted a diner up ahead, bright lights, cars in the lot, people inside. I swerved into the lot without thinking. The sedan didn't follow this time. It kept going straight, like it had never been chasing me at all. I sat in the car for a few seconds, my heart hammering, my skin cold with sweat. I didn't move until I was sure he was gone. Then I went inside and sat in the busiest part of the diner, staring out the window for almost an hour, just making sure he didn't come back. He never did. I never saw him again. But I check my rearview mirror a lot more now. I checked into the hotel late. It wasn't anything fancy, just a roadside place off the highway, the kind of hotel where the lobby smelled like old carpet and the front desk worker barely looked up when you walked in. But it was clean enough, and I was too tired to care. I'd been driving all day and just needed a place to sleep. The guy at the front desk gave me my key card and told me my room was on the second floor. Room 214. I took the elevator up, found the room, and went inside. It was a standard setup: bed, desk, TV, bathroom. The air was a little stale, but I wasn't going to complain. I locked the door, flipped the metal latch, and set my bag down. I changed into something comfortable, turned on the TV for background noise, and climbed into bed. I must have dozed off fast because the next thing I knew, I was waking up to a noise. A sharp click. The door unlocking. At first, I thought I was dreaming. My brain was still foggy from sleep, but then I saw the handle turn and the door opened. A man walked in. He froze when he saw me, just as surprised as I was. For a second, neither of us moved. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, wearing jeans and a dark jacket. He had a duffel bag slung over his shoulder, like he had just checked in. His eyes flicked to my suitcase by the desk, then back to me. "This is my room," he said. His voice was calm, like he genuinely believed it. Like I was the one who had just walked into his room. I sat up fast, my heart slamming against my ribs. "No, it's not." My voice came out shaky. "I've been here for hours." He didn't move from the doorway. For a second, I thought maybe it was just a mix-up. Maybe the front desk had given him the wrong key. But the way he was looking at me, his face wasn't confused. It was calculating. Then he took a step inside. I threw the blanket off and jumped out of bed, backing toward the desk. My phone was there, charging. My mind was racing. I needed to get out. I needed to call someone. The man raised a hand, like he was trying to calm me down. "Hey, relax. I'm not here to cause trouble." But he wasn't leaving. "Get out," I said, my voice louder this time. He didn't. He took another step inside, his eyes moving around the room like he was making sure I was alone. The only thing between me and him was a few feet of ugly hotel carpet. I lunged for my phone, grabbed it with shaking hands, and held it up. "I'm calling the front desk," I said. That made him pause. His eyes flicked to the door, like he was thinking about something. Then, just as suddenly as he walked in, he exhaled and shook his head. "Must have been a mistake," he muttered, stepping backward. He turned and walked out. I ran to the door and slammed it shut the second he crossed the threshold. My hands were shaking so bad I fumbled with the latch, but I got it locked. Then I grabbed the desk chair and shoved it under the handle. I stood there, breathing hard, waiting to see if he would come back. I didn't sleep after that. I sat on the bed with my back against the headboard, phone in my hand, listening for any sound outside my door. The next morning, as soon as the sun came up, I grabbed my stuff and left. At the front desk, I told them what happened. The guy working the morning shift looked confused, said there were no other guests assigned to my room. Said the key cards were supposed to be unique to each guest. So how did he get in? They had no answer. They just offered me a weak apology and a discount on my stay. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I don't know if he was just some random guy who got the wrong room, or if he was waiting for someone to be inside. But I triple-checked the locks now. Every hotel. Every time. I was just running errands. Nothing unusual, nothing that should have made me feel uneasy. It was early evening, still plenty of daylight left, and I stopped at the grocery store on my way home. The parking lot wasn't too crowded, just scattered cars here and there, a normal weekday. I grabbed a cart and started moving through the aisles, checking my list, just focused on getting in and out. I wasn't paying much attention to the people around me at first, just the usual background noise, carts rolling, quiet conversations, the occasional beep of the registers. But then I noticed him. At first, it was nothing. Just another shopper, someone I didn't think twice about. A man, maybe mid-40s, average height, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He was standing in the produce section when I first saw him, looking at something on his phone. I moved to the next aisle. A minute later, I saw him again. Still on his phone, still looking down, but he had no cart. No basket. He wasn't picking anything up. I kept moving. Another aisle. There he was again. That's when I started feeling it, that tight, crawling sensation at the back of my neck. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, but my gut was telling me something else. I slowed down, pretended to look at a shelf, just to see what he would do. He stopped too. I felt my stomach drop. I picked up a random box, pretended to read the label, waiting to see if he moved on. He didn't. I switched aisles again, this time turning quicker. I passed 2 more sections, stopped near the refrigerated drinks, and glanced over my shoulder. He was there. Not close, but not far either. Always within a few feet. Still pretending to be looking at his phone. I tried to stay calm, to act like I hadn't noticed. I moved to another aisle, then another, just to see if he'd follow. He did. He never picked up a single item. Never even looked at the shelves. Just stayed near me, lingering, pretending. I needed to get out of there. I headed toward the checkout lanes, my pulse hammering. I wanted to run, but I forced myself to walk normally. I picked the closest open register and started unloading my cart. I didn't see him at first. Then, just as the cashier started ringing me up, I saw him again. He was standing near the entrance now, leaning against a display of gift cards, still pretending to scroll through his phone. Waiting. I felt my hands shake as I swiped my card. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat. I thought about telling the cashier, but what would I even say? That man is standing there? He followed me? He hadn't done anything yet. He hadn't spoken to me, hadn't touched me, hadn't even acknowledged me directly. I took my bags, gripping them too tight, and walked toward the exit. I didn't look at him, but I could feel his eyes on me. I stepped outside, into the parking lot, scanning for my car. My legs felt unsteady, but I kept walking, kept moving. My car was just a few rows down. Then I saw him. He was already there. Standing next to my car, pretending to be on his phone. I felt a wave of cold panic rush through me. He hadn't beaten me to the parking lot. He hadn't needed to. He'd known which car was mine before I even got there. I stopped walking. My hands tightened around the grocery bags. I wasn't sure what to do. He wasn't looking at me, but I knew he was aware of me. He stood too casually, too still, like he was waiting for something. I forced myself to breathe, to think. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to let him know he was scaring me, but I wasn't about to walk up to my car either. I spotted a couple getting into their SUV a few spots down. I walked toward them instead. The moment I changed direction, I saw him shift. He looked up. Then he stepped away from my car, slowly, like he didn't want to look obvious. He walked toward the far end of the lot, toward another row of cars, pretending again. I reached the couple's SUV and stopped, pretending to check my phone. I watched him out of the corner of my eye. He didn't leave. He circled back, moving slower now, like he was trying to figure out if I was going to my car or not. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I needed to do something, now. I turned and walked back toward the store. Not fast, not running, just steady. I didn't look behind me. I went straight through the automatic doors and back inside, my breath coming in shallow bursts. I stood near the registers, pretending to look at something on my phone. I waited. A minute passed. Then two. I finally glanced outside. He was gone. I stayed in that store for another 10 minutes, just to be sure. When I finally walked out again, the lot felt emptier. I checked my surroundings, checked my car, made sure he wasn't hiding anywhere nearby before I unlocked the doors. I got inside, locked everything, and left as fast as I could. I don't know what he wanted, but I know he wasn't shopping. I worked nights at a storage facility just outside of town. It wasn't a bad job, quiet, mostly uneventful. People came in during the day to drop off their stuff, and by evening, it was usually dead. My shift was just checking security cameras, making sure no one was sneaking in after hours, and walking the rows of units a couple of times. Easy money. That night, I was the only one there. The facility had 2 long rows of storage units, stretching back into an empty lot, with a small office at the front. The only sounds were the hum of the fluorescent lights and the occasional creak of metal doors settling in the cool night air. Around midnight, I was in the office, flipping through paperwork, when I heard a loud bang from somewhere outside. It wasn't a small noise. It sounded like something heavy had fallen over. I sat up, listening. Nothing. I checked the cameras, flipping through the angles. Most of them showed empty rows of storage units. Then I spotted something on the far end, Unit 43. The door was slightly open. That was weird. I had walked through earlier, and I knew for a fact all the units were locked up. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was cool, and the night was dead quiet. My boots crunched against the gravel as I made my way down the row. As I got closer, I could see the metal door to Unit 43 was lifted about a foot off the ground. Not enough to see inside, just enough to make it clear it wasn't shut properly. I hesitated. Most of the time, if a door was left open, it was just someone forgetting to lock up. But something about this felt different. I crouched down and shined my flashlight under the door. The beam caught the edge of something deep inside, but I couldn't tell what it was. A box? A piece of furniture? It was too dark. I grabbed the handle and lifted the door the rest of the way. The unit was empty. Concrete walls, dust on the floor. Nothing inside except a few old scuff marks. I stepped in, shining my flashlight around, my heartbeat slowing a little. Maybe the wind had rattled it loose. Maybe the last person who rented it didn't close it all the way. Then I heard footsteps. Fast. Coming up behind me. Before I could turn around, the door slammed down. I spun and ran to it, grabbing at the handle, but I heard the unmistakable sound of the latch locking from the outside. Someone had locked me in. I slammed my fist against the metal. Hey! Silence. I pressed my ear against the door, trying to listen. No footsteps. No breathing. Whoever had done it was already gone. I took a step back, gripping my flashlight tighter. The air inside the unit was stuffy, the kind that made it feel smaller than it was. I tried my radio, but all I got was static. My phone. I fumbled it out of my pocket. No service. The walls were thick, Nothing but concrete and steel. I forced myself to take slow breaths. There had to be a way out. I ran my hands along the walls, looking for something, anything I could use. Nothing. The only way out was the door, and that was locked from the outside. I banged on it again, harder this time. If this is a joke, it's not funny. My voice echoed back at me. No response. I stood there, listening to my own breathing. Then, in the silence, I heard something behind me. A soft shuffling sound. I turned so fast I nearly dropped my flashlight. The unit was empty. It had been empty when I walked in, but I swore I had heard something move. The flashlight beam trembled as I swept it across the space. The dust on the floor was undisturbed. Nothing had shifted. I backed up against the door, my heart pounding. Then, from somewhere outside, I heard footsteps again. Slow, purposeful, right outside the unit. I held my breath, pressing my ear against the metal. The footsteps stopped just on the other side of the door. I didn't speak, didn't move. Then I heard something worse. A slow, deliberate scrape of metal against metal. Someone was dragging something. I swallowed hard, trying to think, trying to stay calm. If someone was messing with me, they weren't in a hurry to leave. I looked around, my mind racing. There had to be something I could use. Then I remembered some of the older units had faulty locks. If you hit them hard enough, sometimes they slipped. I grabbed the flashlight with both hands and swung at the door handle as hard as I could. The metal clanged, but it didn't budge. I hit it again. Harder. The footsteps outside stopped. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. Then, slowly, whoever was out there leaned against the door. I heard the slight creak of their weight pressing into it. They were listening. I gripped the flashlight so tight my fingers ached. Then, the footsteps retreated. Whoever it was, they were walking away. I waited, counting the seconds, straining to hear if they were really gone. Then I swung at the handle again. This time, the lock snapped. I grabbed the bottom of the door, lifted it just enough to squeeze through, and bolted. The lot was empty. No cars. No people. Just rows of silent storage units under the dim floodlights. I didn't stop running until I was inside the office with the door locked behind me. I checked the cameras. Unit 43's door was wide open. The lot was still empty. There was never a car. Never anyone caught on the footage. Just me, standing in the open doorway, like I had locked myself inside. I was at a bar with a couple of friends, nothing crazy, just a few drinks to unwind after work. It was getting late, and I was tired, so I decided to head home before the rest of them. I didn't drive that night, so I ordered a rideshare like I always did. The app showed a white sedan, driver's name was Mark, license plate ending in 6J2. 5 minutes away. I said my goodbyes, stepped outside, and pulled my jacket tighter. It was chilly, and the sidewalk was mostly empty except for a few people smoking near the entrance. A car pulled up a minute later. White sedan. Right make, right model. The headlights washed over me as it slowed to a stop by the curb. I stepped closer, checking the license plate. I don't know why, but my brain didn't fully register it. I saw 6 and J, and that was enough. I opened the door and got in. "Hey," I said, settling into the back seat. The driver didn't say anything, just gave a slight nod and started driving. That was the first thing that felt off. Most drivers say something, confirm my name, greet me, something. But he just pulled away from the curb in silence. The second thing I noticed was that the car smelled weird. Not bad, just off. Like old cologne and something else I couldn't place. The air felt heavy, like the windows hadn't been rolled down in a long time. I told myself I was overthinking it. Maybe he wasn't the chatty type. Maybe I was just tired. Then my phone rang. I glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number, but I answered anyway, just out of habit. "Hello? Hi, this is Mark, your rideshare driver. I'm outside the bar. Are you still coming?" My stomach dropped. I turned my head slowly, looking at the man in the driver's seat. His hands were tight on the wheel, knuckles slightly pale. He wasn't looking at me, just staring straight ahead, driving. I didn't say anything. I just ended the call and forced myself to stay calm. I looked down at my phone, opened the app. My actual ride was still waiting outside the bar. The car I was in wasn't even registered on the app. I had gotten into the wrong car. No, not the wrong car. Someone had pulled up, pretending to be my ride. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to stay steady. "Hey, I think I got in the wrong car." The man didn't react. I gripped my phone, fingers shaking. "Can you pull over?" He didn't even flinch. The car kept moving, smooth and steady, taking turns that didn't seem random but weren't on my usual route home either. I felt my chest tightening. I checked the door handle, slowly, carefully, trying not to make it obvious. The lock was engaged. I glanced up at him again. His jaw was tight. His eyes stayed on the road. He hadn't asked me where I was going. I knew then he had no intention of letting me out. I forced my voice to sound calm. "Hey, seriously, I made a mistake. Just let me out here." Nothing. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might pass out. I needed to do something. I reached for my phone again, pretending to type. I just texted my boyfriend. He's expecting me in 5 minutes. I lied. That made him react. His grip on the wheel twitched. I pressed forward. He tracks my rides, so if I don't show up soon, he's gonna check in. Silence. Then, the car slowed down. Not to a stop. Just a little. We turned onto a quieter street. Fewer lights. Fewer people. I knew I was running out of time. I reached for the door handle again, gripping it tight. "Let me out," I said, louder this time. "Now." Still nothing. Then I did the only thing I could think of. I unlocked the door myself and grabbed the handle. That made him react. He swerved slightly, one hand darting out toward me. "Hey." I didn't wait. I threw my weight against the door and shoved it open, tumbling out before he could grab me. I hit the pavement hard, my knees scraping against the concrete. The car screeched to a stop, and for one horrifying second, I thought he was going to throw it into reverse. But then he sped off. Gone. I scrambled to my feet, shaking, gasping for air. My hands were bleeding. My phone was still clutched in my fingers. I dialed 911. I never saw his face clearly. Never caught his plate. The police took my statement, but there wasn't much to go on. My real rideshare driver had waited a few minutes before canceling the trip. No one ever found out who the man in the white sedan was. But I know one thing. He wasn't just some guy picking up the wrong passenger. He had been waiting for me. I lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the third floor of an older building. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small place with outdated cabinets and thin walls, but the rent was cheap, and I didn't need much. I'd been there about a year, and nothing strange had ever happened. It was quiet. That's what I liked about it. Then I started noticing things. At first, it was small. A kitchen drawer left open when I was sure I had closed it. A glass on the counter I didn't remember taking out. My TV remote moved from the coffee table to the couch. Little things. Stuff you could explain away if you weren't paying attention. But then it got worse. One morning, I went to grab my keys from the hook by the door, and they weren't there. I always put them in the same spot. I searched everywhere, counters, jacket pockets, under the couch, but I couldn't find them. After 20 minutes, I gave up and grabbed my spare set from the drawer. That night, when I got home, my keys were back on the hook. I stood there staring at them, my stomach twisting. I knew they hadn't been there that morning. I told myself I must have overlooked them, even though I knew I hadn't. A few days later, I woke up to find my fridge door slightly open. Nothing was missing, but a few things had been moved around. A juice carton that had been in the door was now on the top shelf. A pack of cheese slices had been opened, even though I hadn't touched it yet. That was the first time I really felt afraid. I started checking the locks more often. Every night before bed, I'd double-check the front door, the windows, even the tiny bathroom window that barely opened. Everything was locked. Everything was secure. Then, one night, I heard something. It was late, maybe 2 or 3 in the morning. I was half asleep when I heard a faint thump from somewhere in the apartment. Not loud, but enough to jolt me awake. I lay there, listening. Then I heard it again. A soft, shuffling sound. I sat up, my pulse hammering. It was coming from the closet. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, aiming it at the closet door. It was shut, just like it always was. But I swore I had heard something inside. I got up slowly, my hands ice cold. I reached for the doorknob and pulled it open. Nothing. Clothes, boxes, shoes. Nothing out of place. But I knew I had heard something. I aimed my light lower, scanning the floor. That's when I saw it. A seam in the floorboards. A square outline near the back of the closet that I had never noticed before. I crouched down, my breath shallow. I pressed my fingers along the edges, feeling a small indentation. It was a trapdoor. I hesitated, my stomach tightening. Then I hooked my fingers under the edge and pulled. The wooden panel lifted, revealing a dark, narrow crawl space beneath my apartment. The smell hit me first. Stale air, dust, something else, something sour and rotten. I aimed my flashlight inside, and that's when I saw it. A mattress. A dirty, stained mattress stuffed into the cramped space. Beside it were empty food containers, crumpled plastic wrappers, a half-empty water bottle. Someone had been living down there. I stumbled back, my entire body going numb. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I slammed the trapdoor shut and bolted from the closet, grabbing my keys and phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock my front door. I ran out into the hallway, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. I called the police. They searched the crawl space, but by the time they got there, it was empty. No person. No sign of who had been staying there. Just the mattress. Just the food. Just proof that someone had been there for God knows how long. The landlord had no explanation. No record of the crawl space even existing. I moved out the next week. To this day, I check every closet, every attic, every crawl space in any place I live. Because I know now, just because you live alone doesn't mean you're the only one there. I had just finished a long day at work and was eager to get home. The office building was quiet as usual at that hour, the hum of the air conditioning and the faint sound of the vending machine in the lobby the only noises breaking the silence. I walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. The elevator arrived with a soft ding, and I stepped in. I was the only one there, and the doors slid closed behind me with that familiar, metallic sound. The floor numbers lit up above the door as the elevator began its slow ascent. Just as the doors were about to close completely, I heard footsteps approaching, followed by the sound of the button being pressed. I turned to see a man stepping in. He wasn't anyone I knew, just a middle-aged man in a dark suit, carrying a briefcase. He didn't look particularly odd, just another office worker, though I did think it was strange that he had stepped in without any real rush. He stood a few feet away from me, his back to the doors, his briefcase resting in one hand. We didn't make eye contact at first. I just stared at the elevator numbers, my mind still on the day's events. But as the doors were about to close, he pressed a button on the panel. It wasn't the floor he'd gotten on at, but a lower one. That caught my attention, and I glanced at him. He hadn't looked at me, just pressed the button, but now I couldn't help but wonder. Why press a button for a floor lower than his own? Maybe he was going to meet someone. Maybe he made a mistake, I thought. I didn't say anything, just let my eyes linger on him for a moment before I turned back to the doors. The elevator started its descent, the quiet hum the only sound between us. When we reached the floor where he had pressed the button, the doors opened with a soft ding, but he didn't move. I glanced at him again, confused. He was still standing there, facing the doors, not moving an inch. His briefcase was held tightly in his hand. I couldn't help it, I felt a pang of unease. My instinct told me to get out of the elevator right then and there, but I didn't want to appear rude or paranoid. It was just an elevator. Just a man who'd gotten on at the wrong floor. He would get out soon. But when the doors were about to close again, he turned toward me. The look on his face wasn't anything threatening. He wasn't angry, but he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It wasn't a smile like someone you'd run into at work or meet for the first time. It was a strange, wide smile that seemed to stretch just a little too much for comfort. It felt wrong. I was frozen for a second. I couldn't explain why, but something about it made my stomach flip. The doors started closing again, but the smile didn't leave his face. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, his eyes never leaving mine as the doors slid shut, trapping us both inside again. For a moment, I thought I might be imagining it. Maybe I was just tired from the long day, or maybe it was the dim lighting in the elevator that made his face look off. But no, his smile was still there in my mind as the elevator continued its slow descent. I stood there, my heart racing in my chest. The walls felt closer all of a sudden. The elevator was getting smaller, and the air seemed thicker. I didn't know what to do. The elevator kept moving, going down one floor after the next. The man hadn't moved. He didn't even shift his weight. I couldn't stop looking at him. His face was still smiling, though now it seemed a little too wide, a little too forced. His eyes had that emptiness behind them, like he was staring through me, not at me. I don't know how long I stood there, watching him. I didn't want to make a scene, but every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out. The elevator finally reached my floor, and when the doors opened, I didn't wait. I didn't even glance at the man again. I just bolted out the moment the doors opened, my feet practically stumbling over each other as I walked out into the hallway. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, a nervous sweat starting to beat on my skin. I didn't even look back. As I walked quickly to my apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still there, watching me, though I knew logically that was impossible. Still, every time I turned a corner or passed a window, I expected to see him there. I made it inside my apartment, double-locked the door, and leaned against it for a while, trying to calm my breath. The smile, the way he looked at me, kept flashing in my mind. I couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. Later that evening, I checked my phone for any missed calls or messages, just to distract myself, and I saw a notification from the building's security app. It was a routine alert, telling me about recent elevator use in the building. I scrolled down, my finger pausing as I noticed something odd. The elevator footage from earlier, the one I had taken, had a timestamp, 6:24 p.m. But in the footage, something was off. There was no one else in the elevator when it reached my floor. There was only me getting on and getting off, but the man had never stepped off the elevator. He had never been there. The footage only showed the doors opening and closing. No one had gotten off. There was nothing but the empty elevator, moving down the floors without anyone inside. I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers felt numb. Something clicked in my brain, and for the first time, I felt something close to fear. Not just unease, but real fear. I don't know who that man was or why I saw him there. But the truth is, I didn't leave that elevator alone. I was on a long road trip, headed out to visit family, and the drive was already taking longer than I had expected. It was late, and I'd been driving for hours, so I decided to stop at a gas station to stretch my legs and grab a snack. It wasn't the nicest place, but it was the only station I'd seen in miles. The lights were dim, and the parking lot looked empty, save for a couple of trucks and a few cars scattered around. I pulled in, got out, and walked toward the building. There was an old sign above the door, half lit, but still visible. I didn't pay much attention to it, just needed to use the restroom and get back on the road. When I walked in, the place was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you feel like something's not right, even if you can't put your finger on it. The gas station had a faint smell of stale coffee and old paper. The cashier was standing behind the counter, but he didn't look up when I walked past. I headed to the restroom, which was tucked at the back of the store. The door was heavy, and it creaked when I opened it. Inside, it was just a plain restroom, nothing special. The flickering fluorescent light above buzzed a little, but it wasn't anything alarming. I used the bathroom, washed my hands, and was about to head out when something felt off. I turned the handle to leave, but it didn't budge. At first, I thought maybe it was just stuck. I twisted it again, giving it a little more force, but still nothing. I could feel the cold metal beneath my palm, and panic started creeping in. I knocked on the door, trying to stay calm. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaky. "Is someone out there?" No response. I took a step back and looked around the small restroom, trying to think of what to do. The only window was small, far above my head, and there was no way I could reach it. The door was the only exit. I knocked again, harder this time. "Hey, let me out." And that's when I heard it. A faint noise, almost like a soft scraping sound, coming from the other side of the door. I froze. Then I heard it again, a slow, deliberate jiggling of the door handle. Not enough to make it budge, but just enough to let me know someone was trying to open it. My heart started racing, and I backed up against the wall, away from the door. The air in the room suddenly felt thick, like I couldn't breathe as easily. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Why was someone trying to get into the restroom? "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. There was no answer. But I could hear something else now, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming through the crack in the door. It was a low, hushed voice, too quiet to make out the words, but it sent a chill down my spine. I pressed my ear to the door, hoping to hear more clearly. The voice was getting louder, but it was still hard to understand. And then, out of nowhere, the door handle rattled harder. This time, it felt like someone was really pushing against it, trying to force their way in. I gasped, taking a step back. The handle stopped jiggling, and the whispering stopped. I was left standing there in the silence, my breath coming in quick bursts. What the hell is going on? I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in that small, locked room, but I couldn't go out either. There was something wrong on the other side of that door. I had to think fast. I tried again to open the door, but the handle wouldn't move. Then, a sudden thought hit me, my phone. I grabbed it from my pocket and dialed 911, my hand shaking so much I could barely hold the phone steady. The dispatcher answered almost immediately. 911, what's your emergency? I could barely speak. I'm locked in a restroom at a gas station. Someone is trying to get in. I could hear the dispatcher typing, asking for the location, but I could barely focus on the words. I had to keep my eyes on the door, keep my ears trained on the faint sounds from the other side. "Stay calm," the dispatcher said. "Help is on the way." "What's your location?" I told her the address, my voice cracking. I could still hear the faint whispering. It was getting louder now, and the door handle was jiggling again. I pressed my back against the wall, trying to make myself as small as possible. "Please," I whispered, more to myself than anyone else, "please help me." I couldn't hear anything else for a few seconds, just the sound of my own breathing, panicked and fast. And then, the whispering started again. This time, it was louder, clearer. I heard a man's voice, soft but clear enough for me to make out a few words. "I know you're in there," he said, almost as if he was savoring the moment. "You can't hide from me." My stomach dropped. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to shout at him, tell him to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to speak. All I could do was listen. Another few seconds passed, then the door handle stopped moving. The silence stretched on. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, for the door to open, for the voice to say something else. But it never came. A few minutes later, I heard the sound of footsteps fading away. The rattling stopped. The door handle remained still. I didn't dare move, not yet. I waited, holding my breath, afraid that the moment I made a sound, he would return. And then I heard something else, the sound of a car engine, starting up and driving away. I didn't know if it was him or just someone passing through, but I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed the door handle one more time. This time, it opened. I rushed out of the restroom and into the store, heart still pounding. The cashier looked at me, confused. I didn't say a word, just bolted past him, out into the parking lot, and into my car. I drove off, not caring where I went, as long as I was far from that gas station. I never went back. I still don't know who that man was or why he was there, but I know I was lucky to get out. And now, every time I stop for gas at a new place, I check the restroom door twice before I go in. I check the locks. I check the windows. And I never let myself forget the whispering. I'm not sure what I thought was going to happen that night, but I didn't expect any of it. It was after midnight, and I was on my way home from a long shift at work. I didn't have much in mind other than grabbing a quick snack. I'd been working long hours lately, and I wanted something to eat before heading to bed. There's a 24-hour convenience store on the corner near my apartment, a place I stop by all the time. It wasn't anything special, just the basics: drinks, chips, snacks, and some random stuff that you never really need but end up buying anyway. When I walked in, the store felt unusually quiet. The lights flickered a little, like they were struggling to stay on, but that wasn't anything new. The shelves were mostly full, and the aisles were well lit, but there was something off about the atmosphere. It was almost like the store was too empty. There was only one person working behind the counter. A young guy, maybe in his 20s, wearing the store's uniform. I'd seen him a few times before, always friendly enough. He had that tired look people get when they work night shifts. I grabbed a drink from the fridge and some snacks off the shelf. Nothing too fancy. I don't know why, but I kept glancing over at the cashier. He wasn't really looking at me, but he seemed on edge. He was fiddling with something on the counter, tapping his fingers nervously. His eyes kept darting to the door and the storage room behind him, as if he was waiting for something. I felt a little uncomfortable, but shrugged it off. It was late, and people get weird on night shifts sometimes. I went to the counter to pay for my stuff. The cashier didn't seem to notice I was there right away, so I stood there for a second. I figured he was just tired or maybe had something on his mind, but he finally looked up at me. "Ah, sorry about that," he mumbled, his voice shaky. Just a second." He grabbed the items, rang them up, and handed me my change. His hands were shaking slightly, and he looked over his shoulder at the storage room again, his eyes darting back and forth like he was checking if someone was about to walk in. I didn't say anything, just took my bag and headed for the door. But as I reached for the handle, something strange happened. I thought I heard a noise coming from the back of the store. It sounded like someone moving around in the storage room, maybe knocking over a box or something. It wasn't loud, but it definitely caught my attention. I turned around, and the cashier was standing there, staring at the storage room like he'd just heard it too. He didn't move, just stood frozen for a second. I could feel my heart rate pick up, just from his reaction. He didn't seem like he was worried about a customer. He looked scared. I shook my head, not wanting to overthink it, but something about the situation didn't sit right with me. I stepped back toward the counter and put my bag on it. "Hey, you all right?" I asked. He blinked and looked at me, his eyes wide, almost startled. Yeah, I'm fine. Just tired. It's been a long night. I didn't buy it. I turned and grabbed a bag of chips from a shelf nearby, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. I figured I'd take a little longer to decide if I wanted anything else, but honestly, I just didn't want to leave the store feeling like something was wrong. When I walked back to the counter a moment later, I was a little confused. The cashier was gone. I hadn't heard him leave or anything. The door to the back was shut, and there was no sign of him anywhere. I stood there for a second, trying to make sense of it. The store wasn't busy, and he wasn't doing anything that should have taken him away from the counter for that long. I looked over at the door. The lock was now engaged, the little red light blinking to show it was locked. The door to the storage room was still closed, but there was no sign of him. I couldn't hear any footsteps or movement. It felt eerily quiet again. I stepped back from the counter, feeling a lump form in my throat. That's when I saw him. A man stepped out from the storage room, his eyes meeting mine for the first time. He was tall, maybe in his mid-30s, dressed in dark clothes, but his expression was completely blank. He didn't say anything. He just stepped out into the store, looking like he had been standing in the back for a while. My heart stopped. I could feel every part of my body telling me to leave. I took a step back, closer to the door, my eyes locked on the man as he casually walked to the counter where I had just been. It was clear he didn't belong there. The way he moved, the way his eyes flicked over to me like he was noticing me for the first time, but not in a curious way, in a way that made my skin crawl. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen. He reached behind the counter like he was getting something, then turned to me with a slow smile. "You leaving?" he asked, his voice flat, like he was making small talk. I nodded, my mouth dry, barely able to get the words out. "Yeah. I just need to get out of here." "Right," he said. He stood there for a second, still watching me. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was something off about the whole situation. He didn't seem like a worker or a customer. I felt the door handle against my back and grabbed it without thinking, quickly pulling it open and stepping out. The cold night air hit me immediately, but I didn't look back. I didn't want to. I didn't even care if I had left my change on the counter. I was out of there, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't drive straight home. I kept thinking about the man, the cashier, and the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. There were too many things that didn't add up, and I couldn't shake the image of the man stepping out of the back room like it was normal. I didn't go back to that store. I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed or if the cashier had come back. I don't know if it was just a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had barely escaped something bad. And now, whenever I pass that convenience store, I can't help but look to see if anyone's watching from the inside. It happened about 6 months ago. I still think about it all the time, especially late at night. I live in an old townhouse in a row of similar houses. It's quiet, usually, and I'm on good terms with my neighbors. But one day, something happened that made me question everything I thought I knew about the place. I was on my way out when I saw Mr. Dawson, my neighbor, struggling with a large, bulky box in front of his door. He wasn't exactly old, but he was a little slower than me, and I could tell he was struggling. I offered to help, and he gratefully accepted. We were both living on the second floor, so we had to carry this thing all the way down the stairs. It wasn't particularly heavy, but it was big enough to make it awkward. We finally made it to the bottom of the stairs, and Mr. Dawson thanked me. As he was fumbling with the door to the backyard, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a door underneath the staircase that had been sealed off, with a small, rusty padlock keeping it shut. I hadn't seen it in the years I'd lived there. The wall around it was old and worn down, like it hadn't been touched in a while, but the padlock was new. Mr. Dawson saw me looking at it, and for a split second, his expression changed. He went a little pale and immediately glanced away, like he was trying to brush it off. "Oh, that," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "That's just the old maintenance room. No need to worry about it." I was about to ask more, but he quickly added, "I just had it locked up because it's been a pain to deal with, you know? Just a storage thing." Nothing interesting. I didn't press him further, not wanting to make it awkward. Mr. Dawson was a quiet guy, a little reserved. I'd known him for a couple of years, but we never really hung out. He'd wave at me when we crossed paths, but that was about it. I helped him with the box, and after a quick nod, I went back upstairs. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was off about that door, but it stuck with me. Later that night, after I'd eaten dinner and was just winding down, I started hearing something. It was faint at first, just a soft sound that I couldn't quite place. It almost sounded like knocking. I paused and listened, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It wasn't the usual noises from the pipes or the creaks of the building settling. It was a rhythmic knock, coming from somewhere underneath the floor. I walked to the window, thinking maybe it was from another building or the apartment below me. But no, it sounded like it was coming from underneath the house. I stood there for a moment, my heart starting to race. The sound stopped, and I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just the house settling, the wind, anything. But then it came again. Knock. 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 It was faint, like someone was gently tapping on the floor from below. I moved toward the door of my apartment, my stomach twisting. I thought about going downstairs to see if Mr. Dawson was still awake, but I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I should bring it up, but at that point, I couldn't just ignore it. I decided to go down and see if I could hear anything else. As I stepped out into the hallway, I noticed how quiet everything was. Too quiet. My footsteps echoed on the old wooden floor as I descended the stairs. When I reached the landing at the bottom, I stood still and listened. The knocking stopped as soon as I reached the door. I hesitated, staring at the locked door under the stairs. I knew I shouldn't, but something inside me pushed me to go closer. I stepped up to the door, pressing my ear against it. Nothing. Just silence. I could feel my pulse quicken as I stood there, unsure what to do. I knocked on the door, almost as a joke, trying to push away the anxiety that had built up in my chest. No response. I didn't feel like I was supposed to know what was behind that door, but the knocking had made me too curious. I reached for the lock, my fingers trembling as I touched the cold metal. The door didn't give. The padlock was still in place, keeping it shut. I knocked again, this time louder. And that's when I heard something different. It wasn't just a knock anymore. There was something else, scratching. Slow, deliberate scratching on the other side of the door. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I quickly backed away, my mind racing. What was behind there? Why hadn't Mr. Dawson ever mentioned it before? I tried to calm myself down. It was probably just the old building. Pipes, rodents, I told myself. But deep down, I knew something didn't feel right. I turned and hurried back upstairs, my head spinning. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with the house, with that door, with Mr. Dawson. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I couldn't sleep, kept hearing faint noises, the knocks, the scratching. They didn't stop. I kept thinking about the door, wondering if I had just imagined it. Maybe I was just being paranoid, but I couldn't let it go. The next morning, I went to work, but the sounds didn't leave my mind. I had an awful feeling that something was going on under that floor. That evening, I came back home, and as soon as I opened the door, I noticed something strange. The door to the storage room was slightly ajar. I didn't open it. I didn't even move closer. I stood there for what felt like hours, just staring at the crack in the door. The knocking had stopped. The scratching had stopped. But the door was open. I don't know what made me do it, but I decided to talk to Mr. Dawson the next day. I had to know if he was hiding something, or if I was just losing my mind. But when I knocked on his door, it was empty. The apartment had been cleared out. There was no sign of Mr. Dawson anywhere. I never heard the knocks again. I never heard the scratching. But I never went near that storage room either. To this day, I don't know who or what was behind that door, and I don't think I want to. But something about that house, about Mr. Dawson, just doesn't sit right with me. I was traveling alone, backpacking across Europe, and I'd arrived at a hostel in a small town that I'd never heard of. The kind of place you stay in when you're on a tight budget and just need a bed for the night. It wasn't much bare bones, really, but the vibe was relaxed, and the other travelers seemed friendly enough. I had checked in, tossed my stuff into the shared dorm room, and was about to head out to explore when a group of 4 people approached me in the common area. They were sitting around a table, drinking coffee and chatting, and when I walked by, one of them looked up and waved. "Hey, you're new here, right? Where are you from?" I smiled and introduced myself. The woman who'd waved smiled back, her eyes bright, almost too bright. "You should join us for dinner tonight," she said. "We're going to a little restaurant down the street. It's cheap and cozy. You'll love it." At first, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I wanted to eat with a group of strangers, but something about their openness made me feel like it could be a nice change. I'd been traveling solo for a while, and while I enjoyed the independence, I missed casual conversation. "Sure, why not?" I said. "Great." She smiled again, and the others chimed in with quick, easy nods. It felt like they had all decided for me, but I didn't mind. We left the hostel together. There was an unspoken comfort in their company, something familiar in their faces, like they'd been friends for years. The walk to the restaurant was short, just a few blocks down the street, but it felt longer somehow. I couldn't explain why, but the air around us felt dense, as though the night itself was waiting for something. When we arrived, the small restaurant was exactly how they had described it. Cozy, warm, with dim lighting and a soft hum of voices around us. We were seated at a round table toward the back, and I noticed right away that the place was nearly empty. Only one other couple was there. The conversation flowed easily at first. They asked me about my travels, where I'd been, and where I was going next. The food was good, nothing fancy, but comforting. I felt myself relaxing, the tension of being alone in a foreign place beginning to lift. But as the evening went on, something started to feel off. At first, it was subtle. One of the men in the group, I think his name was Lucas, kept glancing around the room, his eyes darting to the door, the windows, like he was scanning the place for something. I caught his eye once, and he immediately smiled, but there was something forced about it. Then, about halfway through the meal, the woman who had invited me, Sarah, suddenly asked, "Do you know where you are?" The question caught me off guard. "Excuse me?" I said, lowering my fork. "Do you know where you are?" she repeated, but this time, her voice had a strange edge to it, like she was trying to see if I was paying attention. I looked around the room, unsure how to respond. "We're in a restaurant," I said, trying to keep it light. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Right," she said, her voice flat. I didn't know how to react, so I just nodded and took another bite of my food. But the conversation felt different after that. The others were quieter now, their words almost mechanical, like they were rehearsing a script. The air felt thick again, like something wasn't right, but I couldn't put my finger on it. The atmosphere in the restaurant changed too. The couple that had been sitting across from us had left, leaving only the 4 of us. The The waiter who had been moving around the room seemed to have vanished. There was no noise now, no clinking glasses or soft laughter. It felt too quiet. I looked toward the door, then back at the group. "Is everything all right?" I asked, my voice small. "Yeah, everything's fine," Lucas said quickly, but again, his eyes flicked toward the door, like he was waiting for something. I wasn't sure what, but something in me told me I needed to leave. I made an excuse, saying I was tired and had to get back to the hostel. I wasn't rude, but I was firm. I stood up and reached for my coat. That's when things shifted. The mood in the group changed in an instant. They all stood up with me, but instead of letting me head for the door, they slowly began to move around me, casually but deliberately. The exit seemed further away now. "Are you sure you want to go already?" Sarah asked, her voice pleasant, but there was something dark in her tone. "Yeah, we were hoping to get to know you better," Lucas added, his voice too smooth. I looked around, my heart starting to race. Something was very wrong now. I forced a smile, trying to mask my panic. "I'm fine, really. I'll just head back." As I turned toward the door, one of the men, the one I hadn't spoken much to, whose name I couldn't remember, stepped in front of it. His face was expressionless, his body blocking the way. "Where are you going?" he asked. I swallowed hard. "Back to the hostel," I said, my voice wavering. "I need to get back." He didn't move. The room felt smaller. The walls were closing in. I didn't know what to do. My instincts were screaming at me to run, to break past them, but I didn't want to make a scene. I wasn't sure what they were capable of. I forced my body to stay calm, but I couldn't keep the tremor out of my voice. "You're blocking the door." For a moment, there was silence. Then Sarah spoke again, her voice lower now, almost whispering. "Do you really know where you are?" That was it. Everything clicked. The way they had moved around me, the way the air felt heavy. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. They weren't just asking me questions. They weren't just being friendly travelers anymore. They were keeping me in that room. They were trapping me. I wasn't about to find out why. I didn't think. I just acted. I shoved past the man blocking the door and bolted. The cold air hit me as I threw open the door, but I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I ran down the street, toward the hostel, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath sharp in the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached the entrance. I haven't gone back to that restaurant or that part of town since. And I haven't spoken to anyone from that group either. But I think about that night a lot. What would have happened if I'd stayed a little longer? What were they planning? I don't know, but I'm not going to find out. It was a warm Saturday afternoon when I took my son to the park. He had been asking all week to go, and I figured it would be a nice way to spend some time together. The park was busy, as it always is on weekends, with kids running around and families gathering in the shade. There was a new play structure that had just been installed, and my son couldn't wait to try it out. I could tell he was excited just by the way his little feet were bouncing as we walked over. I let him run off to play, keeping an eye on him from one of the benches near the sandbox. There were other parents around, some chatting, others watching their kids. Everything felt normal. The usual park scene. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting on a bench, about 15 feet away from where my son was playing. I had glanced over a few times, thinking maybe he was with someone, but I quickly realized he was alone. He didn't seem to be watching anyone in particular, just staring straight ahead. He had his hands folded in his lap, his expression unreadable. I didn't think much of it at first. People come and go at parks all the time, right? But the longer I watched him, the more uncomfortable I felt. There was something off about the way he was sitting so still, his eyes scanning the area without really focusing on anything. His gaze lingered on the kids, moving from one child to the next, but never looking directly at any of the parents. It was subtle, but I noticed it. I tried to shake it off. Maybe I was overthinking things. I told myself that he was probably just someone enjoying his afternoon, not really causing any harm. But I couldn't help feeling uneasy. I stood up to check on my son, making sure he was okay as he climbed up the jungle gym. When I turned back around, the man was still there, but now he was looking directly at me. Not in a way that seemed friendly or even curious, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I immediately turned my attention back to my son, trying not to look like I was overly concerned. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but the way the man was sitting, completely motionless, staring, there was something about it that just didn't sit right. I watched him for a few more moments, but then I saw my son starting to climb up the slide. He was a bit too small for it, but he loved it anyway, even though it made me nervous every time he tried. As I walked toward him, I glanced back at the man, and that's when I saw him stand up. He didn't walk toward anyone, didn't make a phone call or leave the park. He simply stood up and started walking slowly, almost as if he were following my son's movements. I was immediately on alert. My son was too far ahead for me to stop him if something went wrong. I quickened my pace toward the play structure, my eyes never leaving the man. When I reached the play structure, I knelt down beside my son, trying to act normal, but my heart was racing. I didn't want to make it obvious to him that something felt off. He was laughing, happily climbing, oblivious to the fact that I was keeping an eye on the man, who had now positioned himself at the far side of the park. He was looking directly at us again, his gaze fixated on my son, but now he was standing by the entrance of the park, just watching. I didn't like the way he was staring. It felt intrusive, as if he were sizing us up. I stood up slowly and called to my son, trying to keep my voice steady. "Hey, sweetie, it's time to go." My son groaned but ran over to me, and as we began walking toward the parking lot, I noticed the man was following us. He wasn't moving fast, but he was definitely walking in our direction, slowly and deliberately. I didn't want to make it obvious to my son that I was on edge, so I kept my pace steady, but my mind was racing. I glanced around, trying to see if anyone else had noticed, but it seemed like the park was busy with other families, and no one was paying attention to the man. He was still a few steps behind us, not rushing, but definitely following. I kept my hand tightly on my son's, trying not to panic, but I was already planning my next move. If he kept following us to the parking lot, I would head straight to my car and lock the doors. When we reached the parking lot, I saw the man pause by the entrance, as if making a decision. My heart skipped a beat. Was he going to follow us to the car? I didn't want to find out. I started walking faster, keeping my son close to me as I approached my car. I reached into my bag for my keys, my hands shaking. I unlocked the car quickly, opened the door for my son, and helped him in. I didn't look back, but I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and quickly started the engine. I didn't look in the rearview mirror until I was well out of the parking lot, but when I did, I saw the man standing by the entrance, watching me leave. His face was blank, no expression, just standing there, unmoving. I haven't been back to that park since. I can't explain why I felt so uncomfortable, or why the man followed us, but it's been weeks, and I can't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like he was just waiting for the right moment to make a move, and I wasn't about to stick around to find out what that moment was. It happened a few months ago, but I still think about it almost every day. I'm a college student, and I've been babysitting for a while to make some extra money. One evening, I got a call for a regular babysitting job. The family I usually worked for lived in a nice neighborhood, so I wasn't worried about the safety of the place. I arrived, met the parents as usual, and they left for their dinner date. Everything was normal. The kid I was watching, Ethan, was a sweet boy, around 8 years old. We watched TV for a while, and then he went to bed like he always did. I didn't expect anything out of the ordinary. The parents had told me they would be back by 10, and it was about 9:30 when my phone rang. I looked at the screen and saw the number listed as Dad on the caller ID. I thought nothing of it. Maybe he was just calling to check in, but I answered. "Hello?" I said, trying to sound cheerful. "Hey, this is Ethan's dad," the voice on the other end said. It was deep, but something about it felt a little off. "How's everything going?" "Everything's fine," I replied. "He went to bed about 20 minutes ago. Should be asleep soon." Good, he said. There was a pause before he spoke again. "Hey, I just wanted to ask you something real quick." "Sure," I said, a little confused, but still calm. I was wondering if Ethan's been acting strange lately. Maybe, more quiet or distant. Has he been doing anything unusual? I was a little taken aback by the question. I mean, Ethan was a quiet kid, but I hadn't noticed anything out of the ordinary. No, not really. He's been fine. Just like usual. Okay, he said, sounding a little too relaxed. That's good to hear. How's the house? Everything all right? The house is fine, I said, starting to feel a little uneasy. Nothing wrong with it. Another pause, longer this time. The man's voice dropped, and he asked, "Have you checked the locks on the doors?" I felt a cold chill run down my spine. I knew I had locked the door when I got in. In fact, I'd even checked again when Ethan went to bed just to be sure. "Yes, the doors are locked," I said, trying to sound normal. "Everything's fine." Okay, just making sure. You never know with these things. The conversation was starting to feel a little strange, like he was asking me about the house as if he was trying to make sure something was still in place. My mind started to race. Why was he asking these questions? Was it just concern, or was there something more going on? Is Ethan okay? I asked, trying to bring the conversation back to him. I mean, why are you asking about all of this? Well, like I said, just checking in. Just want to make sure everything's all right, he replied. There was something about his tone that felt off. Like he wasn't being fully honest. Okay, well, everything's fine here, I said, trying to cut the conversation short. I was about to hang up when he spoke again, his voice a little quieter now. Listen, he said, lowering his voice. I'm gonna be home in about 10 minutes. But I need you to do something for me before I get there. I didn't like where this was going. What's that? Check the windows, he said. Make sure all of them are locked. Every single one. My heart began to pound in my chest. I told myself it was probably nothing, that maybe he was just worried because it was late. But it felt too strange. I didn't want to make a scene, but I felt the urge to end the call. Still, I didn't want to seem rude. Okay, I'll check them, I said, trying to stay calm. Is everything all right? Yes, everything's fine. I'll be there soon. Just check the windows, all right? He repeated. I agreed, though my mind was racing. I was starting to feel paranoid, but I got up and began walking around the house. I checked the windows in the living room, the kitchen, and the dining room, making sure they were locked. I moved through the house quickly, my heart hammering in my chest. When I checked the last window in the back, I froze. There was something off about it. It was locked, but the curtain was slightly pulled back, just enough to see someone standing on the other side of the glass. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't tell who it was, but they were standing still, just staring at me through the window. I quickly pulled the curtain back into place, my heart pounding in my chest. My hand shook as I pulled my phone out again to call the police, but before I could do anything, my phone rang once more. The number on the screen read Dad. I took a deep breath before answering, trying to sound calm. Hello? Hey, the man said, but his voice didn't sound right. It was lower now, almost rasping. You checked the windows, right? I didn't know what to say. My mind was racing. The person standing outside couldn't have been the father, could it? The voice on the phone didn't match what I heard outside. Yeah, I checked, I said, trying to sound confident. But the truth was, I was terrified. Everything's fine. There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then he said, You sure? Yeah, I replied, my voice shaking. I'm sure. I'll be home soon, he said. Just don't let anyone in, okay? Don't answer the door for anyone but me. I didn't know what to say. I just nodded, even though he couldn't see me. As soon as I hung up, I bolted for the front door, locked it again, and grabbed my phone. I called the parents, but the line went straight to voicemail. I didn't know what to do next. The situation felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on why. After a few long minutes, I heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. I peeked through the blinds, and for a moment, I thought I saw someone walking toward the front door. My heart stopped. But then, I saw the headlights, and a car pulled up to the driveway. The real father. I felt the tension leave my body as I unlocked the door and opened it. Everything all right? He asked, walking in. I didn't know what to say. I wanted to tell him about the call, about the man on the phone, but I didn't. It was just too weird. He looked at me curiously but didn't ask any more questions. I didn't babysit for that family again. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me, or worse, pretending to be someone else. I still don't know what happened, but I didn't feel safe in that house after that night. I was at the park last Tuesday afternoon, just trying to enjoy a rare moment of peace. It had been one of those weeks where everything felt off, work was stressing me out, family drama was brewing, and I just needed some fresh air. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm, golden light over everything, and there weren't many people around, just a few joggers and a couple of families having picnics. I found a bench under a tree, opened my book, and tried to tune everything out. I should have known the moment I sat down that I wasn't going to get much peace. But at the time, I thought it was just me being overly anxious. I'd been there for about 20 minutes when I heard footsteps approaching. I didn't look up right away, assuming it was just someone walking by. But the footsteps stopped. Hey, the man said, his voice almost too calm. It wasn't a loud greeting, just the kind of voice that made you feel like you didn't have a choice but to acknowledge it. I glanced up. He was standing about a foot away from the bench, looking at me with an almost unsettling intensity. Mid-30s, maybe a little older, with dark hair and a face that looked familiar but not in any specific way. He wasn't particularly tall or imposing, but there was something about him that felt off. Like he didn't belong in this peaceful scene. "Do you come here often?" he asked. It's a typical question, right? One of those small talk openers. I nodded, deciding to be polite. "Yeah, it's nice here. Just needed some quiet today." "Quiet's good, yeah," he said, sitting down on the other end of the bench without asking. He wasn't close, but still, he was uncomfortably near. I figured I'd just finish my chapter and leave, but something in my gut told me to be cautious. I couldn't put my finger on why, but I could feel a shift in the air. He stayed quiet for a moment, then spoke again. "You like to read?" "Yeah, I do," I answered, trying to remain neutral, hoping he would take the hint that I was just here to enjoy the day alone. He leaned forward slightly, and that's when I started getting that prickling feeling along my skin. He wasn't just making small talk anymore, it felt like he was trying to dig deeper. "What's your favorite kind of book?" he asked, his voice low, almost too curious. "I like a lot of different kinds," I said, stiffening. "Just whatever catches my attention." He nodded, then smiled a little, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. There was something unsettling about it, something that made my stomach twist. I tried to ignore the feeling, but it was getting harder. "Are you married?" he asked, his voice softer now, like it was an innocent follow-up. I raised an eyebrow, confused. "No," I said, unsure why he was asking such personal questions. But the tone of his voice was changing, almost like he was trying to dig into my life, piece by piece. "Do you live around here?" he continued. It wasn't a question anymore. It was more like he was gathering information, like he needed it for some unknown reason. At this point, I knew something was wrong. My hands were starting to sweat, and my heart rate had picked up. This wasn't normal. Most people don't ask these kinds of questions out of nowhere. And I didn't know if it was just the vibe he gave off or the way he was staring at me, but it made me feel small. Like I was trapped in this conversation without a way to escape. I tried to push myself off the bench, clutching my book like it could offer some kind of protection. "I'm sorry, I need to go." But before I could get to my feet, he stood up too, stepping in front of me. "You're leaving already?" His voice had dropped, becoming sharper. I was just trying to talk. I didn't answer, just took a step back. My body was telling me to move quickly, to get away from him, but my legs felt frozen. Wait," he said, his tone suddenly more forceful, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of frustration in his eyes. "You can't just sit here and waste my time and then walk away." I froze. What did he mean, waste his time? I didn't owe him anything. I barely even knew him. "I'm sorry," I said, now trying to move around him, trying to be polite but firm. "I don't know you. I'm just trying to enjoy my day." "You owe me a conversation," he said, stepping closer. "You don't get to walk away after wasting my time." I was now completely unnerved. I could feel my body reacting before I even had a chance to process it. My eyes darted around the park, looking for anyone, any kind of help, but the place was empty. The joggers had passed, and the families had packed up and left. It was just the two of us. I stood taller, trying to make myself seem less vulnerable. "I don't owe you anything," I said firmly, stepping back again. My heart was pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I wasn't going to let him see it. "Leave me alone." His eyes narrowed, and for a moment, I thought he might get angry. But instead, he just stood there, staring at me. The silence between us stretched, and I could feel the tension building. like he was trying to decide what to do next. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he just shook his head and mumbled something under his breath. "Fine. But don't think you can just do that. People don't just get to ignore me." I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and walked quickly in the opposite direction, my heart racing in my chest. I could hear his footsteps behind me for a few moments, but when I glanced over my shoulder, he was no longer following. It felt like a lifetime until I reached my car and locked the doors. I drove home with my hands still trembling on the steering wheel, my mind replaying the entire encounter over and over. What had just happened? Why did it feel so wrong? Why did it feel like he was trying to corner me into something I didn't understand? It was just a conversation, but it didn't feel like that. It felt like I was the target of something much darker, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly avoided a very dangerous situation. I haven't gone back to that park since. And every time I see someone approach me in public now, I can't help but feel that same unease, that same fear. I don't think he was just some random person looking for company. I don't know what his intentions were, but I'm not willing to find out. If anything, I learned to trust my instincts more, because I know now that sometimes people don't need to say much to make you feel trapped. It started out like a regular stop. I was driving back from a long road trip, somewhere between exhausted and delirious from being in the car for hours. I pulled into a gas station just off the highway, hoping to stretch my legs and grab a drink. I wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary. It was one of those typical, half-lit, low-key places where you'd stop just to fuel up and keep moving. The pumps were almost empty, with only a couple of other cars scattered around the lot. I parked near the front, ready to top off my tank and grab some snacks. The weather was a little overcast, the kind of gray sky that makes everything feel just a bit off. As I walked toward the door of the station, I noticed a man standing near one of the pumps. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a faded red jacket, a cap pulled low over his eyes, and jeans that looked like they'd seen better days. He gave me a friendly nod when he saw me, and I instinctively nodded back, though I wasn't really in the mood to chat. I'd been on the road for far too long and just wanted to get back home. But then he said something that made me stop in my tracks. "Hey, man, you look like you could use a wash." I stopped, frowning a little. Was he talking to me? I glanced at my car. It wasn't particularly dirty, but the long trip had left it a little dusty. Not enough to make me want to get a full wash, but enough to make me wonder if maybe it wouldn't hurt. "You sure you don't want a free wash while you're here?" he added. "Ah, free?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yep, free. Just trying to help out people like you on the road. Free wash, no strings attached." Something about it felt a little off, but at the same time, I figured it couldn't hurt. I had some time to kill, and if it was truly free, what was the worst that could happen? "All right," I said, pulling my keys out of my pocket. "Why not?" He gave me a smile that seemed almost too wide, like he was trying a bit too hard to seem friendly. Still, I didn't think much of it. I handed him my keys and started walking toward the convenience store to grab a drink. As I walked in, I could still see the man in my car, opening the door and starting to spray something on the windows. I didn't think it was weird at the time, but I should have been more cautious. It only took a minute before the unease started to creep in. I went straight to the cooler, grabbed a bottle of water, and walked up to the counter. The cashier gave me a look that I could only describe as uncomfortable, but I didn't think much of it. Maybe it was just late and he was tired. But when I paid and turned around to head back outside, something felt wrong. The man with my car was gone. I froze, a chill running down my spine. My car was still there, but there was no sign of him anywhere. I glanced over at the other vehicles parked around the lot, but no one was paying attention. The gas station was still mostly empty. It was probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe he was just washing my car in a different part of the lot. But my gut told me otherwise. I could feel my heart rate picking up. Something wasn't right. I started walking towards the exit, scanning the area for any sign of him. And then I saw it. The car. My car. It was moving. I saw it just as it sped out of the lot, tires screeching as it turned onto the highway. I froze. My legs felt like they were made of lead as the realization hit me. The man had stolen my car. I stood there, staring after it for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. It was like a bad dream, something that didn't feel real. I'd been gone for just a few minutes. How could he have taken my car that quickly? I didn't know what to do. I wanted to chase after him, but my legs wouldn't move. I grabbed my phone, hands shaking, and called the police. "They stole my car," I said, my voice trembling. He just took my car. I was only inside for a minute. I could hear the dispatcher trying to calm me down, asking for my location and the details of the car. But all I could think about was how quickly it had happened. How had he done it? Was he just waiting for someone to leave their car unattended? Did he know exactly what he was doing? I walked back to the pump, staring at the empty spot where my car had been parked. The whole scene felt surreal. A couple of minutes later, the police arrived. They asked me to explain what had happened. I told them everything I could remember, but it didn't seem like much. I'd been inside for maybe 5 minutes, tops. When I came out, the car was gone. One officer asked if there was anything valuable in the car, but I couldn't think of anything in the moment. It wasn't like I had a lot of personal things in there, but I realized I didn't even know what the man had been able to take before he drove off. They asked me to wait while they filed the report. I didn't want to stick around any longer, so I left the station and went back to my hotel, my mind racing the entire time. How had he been able to take my car so easily? Was it a setup? Was it the kind of thing he did every night, preying on tired, unsuspecting drivers? The next day, the police called me to say they found the car abandoned at the side of the road. The thief had left it there, empty. I didn't get the car back until a few days later, after they finished collecting evidence. By then, I'd already canceled my insurance and filed a report with the DMV, assuming the worst. I still think about it sometimes. How easy it was for him to approach me, how quickly he had my car in his possession, and how no one at the gas station seemed to have seen anything. I never did find out who that man was or what he really wanted. Maybe it was just a one-off, maybe it wasn't. But now, every time I stop at a gas station, I'm more cautious. I never let anyone touch my keys unless I'm absolutely sure who they are. I should have trusted my instincts from the beginning. I don't know how to explain it, but I think about that weekend all the time now. Every time I get an itch to go camping or rent a cabin, the memory hits me. It wasn't that I felt something was wrong at the time, it was subtle. But it didn't let go. Not then, and definitely not now. We were a group of 6 friends, close friends, the kind you've known forever. We decided to rent this cabin out in the woods for a long weekend. Nothing too fancy, just a small, rustic place tucked away near a national park. The kind of spot where you can disconnect, hike, and just enjoy each other's company. It was supposed to be peaceful, fun, just a break from our busy lives. The drive was long, and by the time we arrived, the sun was already starting to set. The cabin itself was a bit older than we expected, but it looked cozy enough. A wooden structure with a few creaky steps leading up to the front door. The kind of place where you could imagine spending the evening with a warm drink and good conversation. We unloaded our bags, set up some things, and then decided to explore the area a little before it got too dark. The first odd thing happened that evening. We were standing outside, just taking in the quiet. The air smelled like fresh pine in the earth, the kind of air that makes you feel more alive somehow. As we chatted about nothing in particular, one of my friends, Liz, pointed out that there were cigarette butts scattered near the back door. They weren't old either. They looked fresh. I remember she said, "Who's been smoking out here?" We all stopped for a moment, eyes scanning the ground. None of us smoked. At least, none of us did anymore. Not since high school. It was strange to see those cigarette butts, crisp and new, lying there on the dirt. We weren't near any main roads either, just a dirt path and trees surrounding us in every direction. Probably just someone passing through, Matt suggested, trying to brush it off. But it didn't sit right with me. I looked around. The back porch had a small set of stairs leading to the yard, which was completely dark. The trees were so thick back there that it felt like the woods went on forever. There was no sign of anyone, though. The place was secluded, isolated even, and I couldn't imagine why anyone would come that close just to smoke a cigarette and leave. We figured it was nothing, just someone before us maybe, and decided to get some dinner and not let it spoil the mood. We didn't mention it much after that. The first night passed without incident. We stayed inside, ate, drank, and talked. We played cards, laughed, and stayed up late like we always did. The kind of carefree night that makes you feel like nothing bad could ever happen. But the next morning was when things started to feel off. I woke up to the sound of Liz asking from the other room, "Did anyone go outside last night?" We all looked at each other, groggy and confused. "What do you mean?" I asked. I swear I heard footsteps outside my window, like someone walking around the cabin. Did anyone get up to grab something or go outside? We all shook our heads. No one had gotten up, at least not that we knew of. But it was strange, none of us had heard the footsteps. Liz was spooked, but we all laughed it off, blaming it on the wind or some animal. I wanted to tell myself the same thing, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. We went about our day, hiking through the woods and enjoying the fresh air. But as we came back in the evening, there was something else that made my stomach twist. There were more cigarette butts. Not just near the back door this time, but also along the side of the cabin. Fresh ones. It had to be the same brand, too long, slender butts with the same burnt filter, still wet at the end. And again, none of us smoked. "Okay, this is weird," said Matt, his usual laid-back attitude now replaced with a tinge of frustration. "Who's messing with us?" We went outside to take a closer look. I felt my skin crawl when I saw the butts were scattered in a clear trail, leading off toward the edge of the woods. It didn't make sense. Who would be out here smoking, and why would they be leaving their trash behind like that? We stood there for a minute, unsure of what to do. Our laughter had faded, and there was this unspoken sense of discomfort creeping in. None of us wanted to admit it, but the thought of someone else being out there, so close to our cabin, made us uneasy. We stayed inside that night, locked up tight, making sure every window and door was secured. But I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept imagining someone watching us from the trees, hidden just beyond the reach of our lights. The next morning, things only got worse. I woke up earlier than usual, feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I went downstairs to make some coffee and looked out the window. What I saw made my heart stop. There, in the yard, or more cigarette butts. But this time, they weren't scattered around. They were arranged in a perfect circle, like someone had placed them there intentionally. A twisted, strange pattern in the grass, like a ritual or something. I stood there for what felt like forever, just staring. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Liz came in, rubbing her eyes. "What's going on?" she asked when she saw me staring out the window. I didn't answer her right away. I didn't know how to explain it. I didn't know what to say. All I could think about was the fact that someone had been here. Someone had been watching us all along. We weren't alone. Liz saw it too. She gasped. "What is that? Did someone do that last night?" "I don't know," I whispered. "But we need to leave. Now." The panic was rising in my chest. I didn't want to wait around to find out who was out there or why they were doing this. We decided then and there to pack up and leave. No more waiting around. I didn't care if we lost the rental fee or if it ruined the weekend. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. As we packed up the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to step out of the woods or from behind a tree. But there was no one. The woods were eerily quiet, almost too quiet. The cigarette butts were still there, staring back at us, but they didn't seem to matter anymore. We left in a hurry, barely looking back. The drive back was silent. None of us said much, but we all knew. The tension was palpable. None of us had been comfortable since the first night, and I don't think any of us would ever feel the same about that cabin. I still don't know who left those cigarette butts, or why they were doing it. Maybe it was just someone messing with us, or maybe it was something worse. All I know is, I've never been back to that cabin. And I never will. Something about it felt wrong. Something about it still haunts me. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture the butts scattered on the ground, like a sign. A warning. And I can't shake the feeling that someone who wasn't part of our group was there the whole time, watching us from the shadows. I still don't know how I made such a stupid mistake. I was tired, distracted, and not paying attention. I don't have a good excuse, but that's what happened. I live in a big apartment complex, the kind where all the hallways look the same, and late at night, it's easy to get turned around. I had been out running errands, came home, and walked up the wrong flight of stairs. I thought I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I got to what I thought was my apartment, the door was cracked open. Not wide, just enough to make me stop for a second. I remember thinking maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way when I left. That happens sometimes, right? I pushed it open and stepped inside without really thinking. The place was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. I could see the TV was on but muted, playing one of those news channels. The layout was the same as mine, living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. It smelled different, for one thing. Not bad, just not familiar. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet, like it didn't belong there. No answer. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice little details. The furniture wasn't arranged like mine. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize. A pair of boots by the door, not mine, not my roommate's. I froze. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of embarrassment hit me. I thought, oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I turned around, ready to bolt back out the door, but before I could move, I heard the lock click. Someone was standing there, just inside the door. I hadn't even heard them come in. It was a man, tall, mid-30s maybe, wearing a heavy jacket like he'd just come in from outside. He was holding a grocery bag in one hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. "What are you doing in here?" he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, staring at me, and then he set the grocery bag down slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment?" he repeated. His tone didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes," I said. My voice felt weak, like it wasn't carrying the words right. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry." He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt shut. The sound of it snapping into place made my heart jump. "Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours?" he asked. "I was about to," I said quickly. "I swear, I just realized." "Don't lie to me," he cut in. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, almost angry, but still quiet. He took a step closer, and I stepped back without thinking. My heel hit the edge of a coffee table, and I nearly tripped. "I'm not lying," I said. My voice cracked, and I hated how scared I sounded. "I swear, it was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now." He didn't move for a moment, just kept staring at me. Then he nodded slowly, like he was thinking something over. "Okay," he said. "If it was just a mistake, let's talk about it. Sit down." I don't need to sit down," I said, trying to sound calm. "I'll just sit down." It wasn't a request. He wasn't yelling, but the way he said it left no room for argument. I sat on the couch, my hands shaking, and he stayed standing, just watching me. "What's your name?" he asked. I told him. My voice felt so small in the silence. "And you live upstairs?" "Yes," I said. "Just one floor up." "What's your apartment number?" I told him, hoping he'd believe me, hoping he'd let me leave. He nodded again, slowly, like he was filing the information away. "You know," he said, "people don't just walk into the wrong apartment. Not by accident." "It was an accident," I said, my voice shaking. "I swear. I wasn't paying attention." He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to decide if I was worth believing. Then he stepped closer, leaning down so we were at eye level. "Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building?" he asked. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home?" "I'm not a thief," I said quickly. "I promise, I'm not." "You think I don't know what you're doing?" he interrupted. "You think I don't see it?" I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and my chest was tight. I wanted to get up, to push past him and run, but I didn't dare move. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at me. Then he reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. He held it up, like he was going to call someone. "I should call the cops," he said. "Please don't," I said, my voice breaking. "I didn't do anything. I swear. It was just a mistake." He stared at me for another long moment, then lowered the phone. "Get out," he said. I didn't wait for him to say it again. I got up and moved toward the door as fast as I could without running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the deadbolt. I felt his eyes on me the whole time. When I finally got the door open, I stepped out into the hallway and turned back. He was still standing there, watching me, his face completely unreadable. He didn't say anything else, just stood there until I closed the door behind me. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked the door the second I was inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It was a normal Friday night. I had been in my dorm all day, catching up on assignments and half watching a movie in the background. Around 6, I posted a picture of my dinner, just some takeout from the cafeteria, and tagged the location. It wasn't something I thought twice about. Everyone does it, right? After that, I settled in to finish a paper that was due on Monday. My roommate was out for the weekend visiting family, so I had the place to myself. It was quiet, and I liked it that way. It was around 10 when I heard the knock on the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and people usually text before they come by. I got up, thinking it might be someone from my floor, but when I opened the door, I didn't recognize the person standing there. He was tall, maybe late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a jacket that looked a little too heavy for the mild weather. He smiled at me like he knew me, but I had no idea who he was. "Hey," he said. "It's good to see you. It's been a while." I stared at him, confused. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" His smile faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, we met at that thing last month. You probably don't remember. There were a lot of people there." I shook my head. "I think you have the wrong person." No, he said, laughing a little. "It's definitely you. You're my name, right?" Hearing my name come out of his mouth made my stomach twist. I nodded slowly, trying to figure out if I was forgetting something. Maybe we had met somewhere, but he didn't look familiar at all. "See," he said, like that proved his point. "I knew it was you. Mind if I come in? It's a little cold out here." That's when the alarm bells started going off. I didn't know this guy, and something about him felt off. I kept the door halfway closed and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't think I know you. Where did we meet again?" His smile tightened. "Like I said, at that thing last month. Look, it doesn't matter. I just thought I'd stop by since I was in the area." I glanced down the hallway. It was empty. Most people on my floor had gone out for the weekend, and the few who stayed were probably in their rooms with the doors closed. I was suddenly very aware of how quiet it was. "I'm sorry," I said again. "I think you might have the wrong person." His expression changed then. The friendly, casual demeanor slipped away, and he frowned, like he was annoyed. "Come on," he said. "Don't be like that. I came all the way here." I tightened my grip on the door, not opening it any further. "I think you should leave." He didn't move. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to the door frame. "You posted you were here," he said. "Why would you do that if you didn't want people to know?" My stomach dropped. That's when it clicked. The picture I posted earlier. I had tagged my location, my dorm building. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time, but now it felt like the stupidest thing I'd ever done. "I'm going to call campus security," I said, trying to sound confident even though my voice was shaking. "You need to leave." He smirked. "You don't need to do that. I'm just trying to be friendly. You don't have to make this a big deal." "It's already a big deal," I said. "Leave. Now." He didn't move for a second, and I thought he might try to force his way in. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then he shrugged and stepped back, holding his hands up like he was giving up. "Fine," he said. "Whatever. I was just trying to be nice." I didn't respond. I closed the door and locked it as fast as I could, then stood there, listening. For a few seconds, I didn't hear anything, but then there was the sound of footsteps walking away. I peeked through the peephole and saw him heading down the hallway. I stayed by the door for a long time after that, listening and waiting. I didn't know if he was really gone or if he was just trying to make me think he was. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby. After what felt like forever, I called campus security. I told them what happened, and they sent someone to check the building. They didn't find him, but they said they'd keep an eye out. They also told me to report it to the police, which I did the next day. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about how easily he found me. All it took was one post, one stupid little tag, and he knew exactly where I was. I don't post my location anymore. I don't even post pictures until hours after I've left the place. I don't know what he wanted or what he would have done if I had let him in, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I keep thinking about how insistent he was, how he acted like he had a right to be there. It wasn't just creepy. It was terrifying. It was late, later than I meant for it to be. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home from visiting my sister. The highway felt endless, and I was running on fumes literally and figuratively. When I saw the gas station sign, I almost felt relieved. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way places, just a few pumps and a little building with flickering lights, but it was the only thing around for miles. I pulled in, parked next to one of the pumps, and went inside to pay. The place was empty except for the guy behind the counter, a younger guy who barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. I told him I needed to fill up and asked if they had a restroom. He nodded toward the back and muttered something about a key. There wasn't anyone else in the store, so I grabbed the key hanging on the hook by the counter and headed to the restroom. The door was one of those heavy, industrial ones, with peeling paint and a rusty lock. Inside, the place was as bad as you'd expect: dirty tiles, a flickering light, and a smell that made me want to hold my breath. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go. I was quick, trying to touch as little as possible. When I finished, I washed my hands and dried them on my jeans because the paper towel dispenser was empty. Then I went to leave. The door wouldn't open. At first, I thought maybe the lock was jammed. I tried turning the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. I checked the lock itself, twisting it back and forth, but it was already unlocked. That's when I realized the problem wasn't the lock. The door was being held shut from the outside. I knocked, then banged on the door. "Hello? Hey." The door stuck. My voice echoed in the tiny space, but there was no answer. I waited, listening. I thought maybe the guy at the counter would come check, but it was dead silent. I banged again, harder this time, and yelled, "Can someone open the door?" Nothing. My heart started to race. I tried to think logically. Maybe the door was heavy, and it got stuck somehow. Maybe the guy at the counter didn't hear me. But then I remembered how quiet it was in the store when I walked in. He had to have heard me. I pulled out my phone to call the gas station, but there was no signal. Just a spinning wheel where the bars should have been. I tried moving around the tiny room, holding the phone up, but it didn't make a difference. I was completely cut off. Panic started creeping in, but I told myself to stay calm. I knocked again, softer this time, hoping someone passing by might hear me. Hello? Can someone let me out? The door's stuck. My voice sounded shaky now, and hearing it like that made the panic worse. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear anything on the other side. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then I heard something, a shuffling sound, like footsteps. Relief flooded me. Hey! I'm stuck in here. Can you open the door? The footsteps stopped. I waited, expecting to hear the scrape of the lock or the door handle turning, but nothing happened. Hello? I called again. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against me. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving away from the door. Wait. Don't leave. I yelled, banging on the door again. But whoever it was, they were gone. I felt trapped in every sense of the word. The tiny bathroom felt smaller with each passing second, and the silence outside made it worse. I tried to think of a way out. The window was too high and too small to climb through, and the walls were solid concrete. There was no way out except the door. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I heard something again. A faint creak, like the sound of a door opening. My heart leapt. Maybe the guy from the counter had finally realized what happened. I pressed my ear to the door again, straining to hear. Hello? I called, but my voice sounded weak now. The footsteps were back, heavier this time, and getting closer. They stopped just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. Is someone there? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, there was a soft tap on the other side of the door. Just one deliberate knock. I stumbled back, my chest tight and my pulse racing. Who's there? I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked. Let me out. No response. The knock didn't come again. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to help me. They were toying with me. I fumbled with my phone again, praying for a signal, but it was useless. The spinning wheel taunted me, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing down. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just when I thought they might have left, the doorknob turned. It moved slowly, the sound of metal against metal sending a chill through me. I held my breath, frozen in place. The door opened just a crack, enough for me to see a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door didn't open any further, but it didn't close either. I couldn't see anyone on the other side, just the empty space beyond the crack. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I stumbled back, hitting the sink. My hands were shaking, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in there. I don't know where I found the strength, but I ran to the door and pounded on it with everything I had. Let me out. I screamed over and over again. Let me out. And then, as suddenly as it started, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It just swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't even stop to look at the counter as I bolted out of the gas station and into my car. The pump was still in my tank, the meter frozen mid-fill, but I didn't care. I yanked it out, threw it onto the ground, and sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing: I'll never stop at a gas station that isolated again. I always liked running early in the morning. It was quiet, the air felt fresh, and the streets were mostly empty. My usual route took me through a small park about a mile from my apartment. It wasn't big, just a couple of winding paths, some benches, and a lot of trees, but it was peaceful, especially at that time of day. I'd been running there for months and never had any issues. That morning felt like any other. It was just past 5:30 a.m., and the sun was barely starting to rise. I had my usual playlist going, the one I always used to get into a rhythm. The streets were still dark, and the only people I saw were the occasional dog walkers or another runner here and there. When I reached the park, I turned onto the main path, letting my feet fall into their usual pace. I noticed him about halfway through the park. He was standing near a bench, just off the path. At first, I thought he was waiting for someone. He wasn't doing anything, no phone, no dog, nothing. Just standing there, looking straight ahead. I wouldn't have thought twice about it, but something about the way he stood caught my attention. Too still. Too rigid. I kept running, telling myself not to overthink it. Plenty of people use the park, and not everyone looks friendly first thing in the morning. As I got closer, I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye. He wasn't looking straight ahead anymore. He was looking at me. I felt my chest tighten, but I kept going. I didn't slow down, didn't change my pace. Just kept running. My music was still playing, but I turned the volume down low so I could hear if he said or did anything. He didn't move as I passed, but I could feel his eyes on me the entire time. About 20 steps past him, I looked over my shoulder, trying to be casual about it. He was still standing there, but now he had turned around. He was watching me. I told myself to focus. It was early, and maybe he was just out for a walk and curious about someone running by. I'd seen plenty of people in the park who seemed out of place. It didn't mean anything. But then I heard it, footsteps. At first, I thought it might just be someone else entering the park from another direction. I told myself not to panic, not to assume. But when I glanced back again, I saw him. He was walking now, heading in the same direction I was. Not running, not rushing. Just walking. He wasn't close, maybe 50 feet behind me, but he was there. I sped up a little, trying to create more distance between us. I told myself to stick to my route, not to change anything. If he was just walking, I'd be out of the park before he could get anywhere near me. I reached the end of the path and took the usual left turn toward the exit. When I glanced back again, he had turned too. My heart was pounding now, harder than it should have been from just running. I wasn't winded, but I felt like I couldn't breathe. I told myself to stay calm, to keep running, to act like nothing was wrong. But every time I looked back, he was still there. Always just far enough that it felt like I couldn't say anything or confront him, but close enough that I couldn't shake him. When I finally exited the park, I felt a small wave of relief. The street ahead was wider, brighter. A few cars passed by, their headlights cutting through the early morning gloom. I thought about stopping, waiting for him to pass, but something told me that would be worse. I didn't want him to know I was scared. I kept running, heading toward the busier part of my route. There was a gas station about a quarter-mile up. It was small, but the lights were always on, and there was usually someone inside. I decided I'd stop there if he was still following me. I didn't have to look back anymore. I could hear his footsteps now. They were steady, matching my pace. Not speeding up, not slowing down, just following. When I reached the gas station, I didn't hesitate. I turned sharply and went straight inside. The man behind the counter looked up, surprised to see someone this early. I walked to the back, pretending to grab a bottle of water, but really just trying to catch my breath. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I stayed back there for a minute or two before glancing toward the door. He was standing outside. He wasn't looking in, just standing by the edge of the parking lot, like he was waiting for me to come out. His hands were in his pockets, and his head was tilted slightly, like he was listening for something. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in the gas station forever, but I didn't want to leave while he was still there. The man behind the counter asked if I needed help, and I almost told him what was going on. But what could he do? Call the police because someone was walking behind me? After a few minutes, the man outside moved. He didn't leave, just shifted closer to the building, standing by the corner where I couldn't see him unless I walked out. That's when I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. I walked to the counter and told the clerk there was a man outside who had been following me. I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the fear in it. The clerk frowned, looking toward the door, then nodded. He told me to stay inside while he went to check. I watched as he stepped out, looking around. The man was gone. The clerk came back in and told me there was no one there, but I could tell he believed me. He asked if I needed him to call someone or if I wanted to wait for a ride. I nodded, pulling out my phone to call a friend. I didn't care that it was early. I just needed someone to pick me up. While I waited, I stayed near the counter, my eyes glued to the parking lot. My friend showed up about 10 minutes later, and I ran straight to their car, not looking back. I told them everything on the ride home, and they insisted on staying with me for the rest of the day. I didn't go running for a while after that. When I finally did, I chose a different route, one with more people and fewer places to hide. But even now, I can't shake the feeling of those footsteps behind me, steady and deliberate, like they were waiting for something. Like he was waiting for something. It started out as a dumb idea. My friends dared me to hide out in the department store after closing. They said I wouldn't last an hour alone after the lights went off. We'd been hanging out at the mall all afternoon, and by the time we came up with the plan, it was almost closing time. They left before the staff started their final rounds, leaving me alone to figure out how to stay unnoticed. I found a spot behind a rack of winter coats in the men's section. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and the coats hung low enough to block me from sight. I crouched there, waiting, listening as the last announcements played overhead and the store got quieter. Eventually, I heard the sound of the security gates rolling down at the entrances. When everything was silent, I crawled out. The store looked strange in the dark, all shadows and empty aisles. It wasn't scary, not yet. Mostly, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I walked through the aisles, trying not to make too much noise. My plan was to stay for a couple of hours, take a few pictures to prove I'd done it, and then sneak out when the gates reopened in the morning. I headed to the electronics section first. The TV displays were off, but a few laptops were still on, their screens casting faint blue light. I took out my phone to record a video, whispering into the mic about how I was all alone. That's when I heard the first noise, a sharp, metallic clink, like a door handle being turned. I froze, holding my breath, and looked around. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, so I told myself it was just part of the store settling. I kept walking, heading toward the toy section. That's when I saw the flashlight. It was faint at first, a beam of light sweeping across the floor on the far side of the store. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about security. I figured they'd just lock the doors and leave, maybe check the cameras once in a while. But someone was definitely inside, moving through the aisles. I ducked behind a shelf and tried to think. If they caught me, I'd be in trouble. Maybe not arrested, but definitely banned from the mall, and my parents would kill me. I decided to wait until the light passed and then find a better hiding spot until the person left. But the light didn't pass. It got closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wasn't in any hurry. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the back of the shelf. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, listening. Then I heard a voice. "I know you're in here." It wasn't loud, but it carried through the silence of the store. The tone was flat, almost casual, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "I saw you on the cameras," the voice continued. "Come out now, and this will be easy." I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear it. I peeked through a gap in the shelves and saw the flashlight beam swinging back and forth. The man holding it was wearing a uniform, but it didn't look like the mall security I'd seen before. His shirt was too loose, untucked, and there was no badge. Just a dark shape stitched over the pocket. He walked past my aisle, the light sweeping dangerously close to where I was hiding. I stayed frozen, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. After a few seconds, he moved on, but I didn't feel safe. Something about him wasn't right. When I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, I crept out and headed toward the back of the store, where the employee-only area was. My new plan was to hide in the stockroom until morning. The store's cameras couldn't see back there, and I figured the man wouldn't bother checking. The stockroom was cold and smelled like cardboard. Rows of shelves stretched out in every direction, filled with boxes and loose items. I found a spot behind a stack of pallets and sat down, trying to calm myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. There was a message from one of my friends. "Did you chicken out yet?" I started typing a reply when I heard the sound of a door opening nearby. The stockroom door. I shoved my phone into my pocket and scrambled deeper into the pallets, crouching low. The man's footsteps were heavier now, echoing in the quiet space. His flashlight beam cut through the gaps between the shelves, searching. He didn't say anything this time, just walked slowly, methodically. I realized then that he wasn't looking for a thief or someone breaking the rules. He was hunting. I held my breath as the light passed over the pallets where I was hiding. It lingered for a second, then moved on. The footsteps grew fainter, and I thought he might be leaving, but then they stopped. "Do you think I won't find you?" he said. His voice was closer than I expected. "This is my place. My rules." I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't stay there. If he found me, I didn't think he'd just kick me out. There was something wrong with him, something dangerous. I waited until his light moved away, then crawled out from my hiding spot and headed toward the exit. I made it back to the sales floor without being seen. The store was even darker now, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I moved as quickly as I could, trying to stay quiet. The front doors were just ahead, and I could see the faint glow of the mall's lights beyond the gates. I thought I was going to make it. Then I heard the sound of keys jingling behind me. I turned and saw the man standing at the edge of the aisle. He wasn't shining his flashlight anymore, but I could see him clearly enough. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "Leaving already?" he asked. I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the front doors, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. I heard him running behind me, his footsteps faster now, closing the distance. When I reached the gate, I grabbed the bars and shook them, but they didn't budge. The locks were solid, and there was no way I could squeeze through. I looked around, desperate for another way out, and saw the fire exit sign glowing in the distance. I sprinted for it, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The man was still behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the fire exit, I slammed into the bar and pushed it open. The alarm blared, deafening, but I didn't care. I ran outside into the cold night air, my chest heaving. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot. When I finally turned around, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, the alarm blaring behind him, until I was out of sight. I never told anyone what happened. Not my friends, not my parents. I don't even know if they would have believed me. We'd all gone out camping to this spot one of us had found online, tucked way back in the woods off some dirt road. It wasn't anything fancy, just a clearing near a stream with enough space for our tents and a small fire pit. There were 5 of us, me, Mark, Julia, Chris, and Mia. We'd set up camp in the late afternoon, cooked dinner over the fire, and stayed up for a while talking and laughing. The woods were quiet that night, just the sound of the stream and the occasional rustle of leaves when the wind picked up. It was peaceful. We all went to bed around midnight. We were packed into 2 tents, me, Mark, and Chris in one, and Julia and Mia in the other. Everything felt normal. I don't know what woke me up, but when I opened my eyes, it was still dark. It had to have been early morning. The air felt colder, and the fire outside had burned down to just embers. Mark was snoring quietly next to me, and Chris was still, too. I lay there for a moment, listening, trying to figure out why I was awake. Then I noticed it, a faint sound, like something moving outside the tent. It wasn't loud, just the crunch of leaves, soft but close. I held my breath and strained to listen, but it stopped as quickly as it started. I told myself it was probably an animal. This was the woods, after all. I rolled over and eventually fell back asleep. When I woke up again, it was because Mark was shaking my shoulder. The sun was just starting to come up, and the inside of the tent was dim, but I could see the look on his face. He looked uneasy. "Chris isn't here," he whispered. That woke me up completely. I sat up and looked over at where Chris had been sleeping. His sleeping bag was unzipped and empty, his boots gone. I figured maybe he'd just gotten up early and gone to the stream, but Mark's expression made me pause. We got out of the tent and found Julia and Mia already up. They were standing near the fire pit, which Julia had started again. Both of them looked worried. Julia was holding her arms around herself, and Mia was pacing. "Chris isn't here," Julia said, her voice low. "We've been calling for him." The woods felt different in the morning light. The trees that had seemed comforting the night before now felt too close, too thick. The quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, it was heavy. We all started calling Chris's name, walking in different directions but staying within earshot of each other. There was no answer. After about 15 minutes of searching, Mia called out for us to come to the edge of the campsite, near the tree line. Her voice had a strange tone to it, and I felt my stomach twist as I jogged over to where she was standing. She pointed at the ground. At first, I didn't see what she was looking at, but then I noticed the disturbed dirt and leaves. There were marks, faint but clear enough to tell something had happened. The dirt was scuffed up like there had been a struggle, and there were deep impressions in the ground where someone had fallen or been dragged. And then there was something else. A torn piece of fabric snagged on a branch. It was small, just a strip, but it was the same color as the jacket Chris had been wearing. No one said anything for a moment. We just stared at the ground and the torn fabric, the reality of it sinking in. Something had happened to Chris. He hadn't just wandered off. Mark broke the silence first, saying we needed to look farther into the woods. I could tell he was trying to sound confident, but his voice was shaking. We split up into pairs, Mark and me going one way and Julia and Mia going another. We didn't go far, just enough to scan the area around the campsite. None of us wanted to go too deep into the woods. As we searched, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us. Every sound, the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig, made my heart race. The woods were too quiet. There should have been birds, insects, something, but there was nothing. Just us. After about an hour, we regrouped back at the campsite. No one had found anything. No tracks, no sign of Chris. We were all tense, speaking in short, clipped sentences. The atmosphere had shifted completely. The sense of fun and adventure was gone, replaced by a gnawing fear we didn't want to admit out loud. Mia wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Mark argued that we couldn't just leave Chris behind. Julia agreed, but her voice wavered when she spoke. None of us knew what to do. We didn't have cell service out here, and the nearest town was miles away. It felt like we were completely cut off. As we debated, a sound broke through the silence, the sharp crack of a branch snapping. It came from somewhere just beyond the tree line. All four of us froze, our eyes darting toward the direction of the sound. "Chris?" Mark called out, his voice loud and shaky. There was no answer. We waited, holding our breath, but the woods stayed silent. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on us. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. Mia grabbed my arm, her grip tight enough to hurt. "We need to leave," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Mark looked torn, his gaze shifting between the woods and the rest of us. Finally, he nodded. "Let's pack up. Now!" We moved quickly, throwing our gear into our backpacks with shaking hands. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, hidden just out of sight. I kept glancing toward the woods, half expecting to see someone or something step out. But there was nothing. As we hiked back toward the trailhead, none of us spoke. The silence between us was thick, weighed down by the fear we couldn't shake. Every now and then, I thought I heard faint noises behind us, but when I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the trees. When we finally reached the cars, I felt a wave of relief so strong it nearly made me dizzy. We threw our packs into the trunks and got in, locking the doors. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. We reported Chris missing as soon as we reached town. Search teams were sent out, but they never found him. The official story was that he must have gotten lost in the woods, but none of us believed that. Not after what we saw at the campsite. Not after hearing that sound. I don't know what happened to Chris that night, but I still think about it. About the torn fabric. About the marks on the ground. About how close we must have been to whatever or whoever took him. It was supposed to be a simple overnight hike. I'd been planning it for weeks, carefully picking a trail I knew wasn't too crowded but still had enough markers that I wouldn't get lost. I packed everything I needed: food, gear, and my water reservoir, which I triple-checked before leaving. The hike out to the campsite was perfect. The weather was clear, the air crisp. I didn't see another person the whole way, and for once, I didn't mind. It was peaceful, just me and the sounds of the forest. I reached the spot I'd picked out a little before sunset, a flat clearing near a small stream. I set up my tent, cooked a quick meal, and sat outside watching the stars come out. When the temperature dropped, I crawled into my sleeping bag and fell asleep almost immediately. The next morning, I felt ready to tackle the hike back. I packed up camp quickly, not wanting to waste daylight. I took a sip from my water reservoir before zipping it into my pack, and everything seemed fine. The stream nearby was clear, so I refilled my backup bottle just in case and started on the trail. It wasn't until late morning that I noticed something was wrong. I stopped to take a drink and realized the water tasted off. At first, I thought maybe it was the plastic from the reservoir, but I'd never had that problem before. I took another sip, and this time, the taste was stronger, almost metallic. I stopped walking and took the reservoir out of my pack to inspect it. The water looked fine, but the smell hit me as soon as I opened it. It was chemical, sharp, like something you'd use to clean a bathroom. I dumped it out immediately, my heart pounding. I didn't understand. I'd filled the reservoir that morning from the same stream I'd used the night before, and I'd used a filter both times. I checked my backup bottle, and that's when the panic really set in. The water in the bottle had the same smell. I didn't know what to do. I was miles from the trailhead, and the sun was getting higher. It was hot, and I'd already been hiking for a couple of hours. I'd planned my water carefully, and now I didn't have any that was safe to drink. I thought about turning back to the stream near the campsite, but the idea made me nervous. What if there was something in the water there? Or worse, what if someone was there? The thought came out of nowhere, but once I had it, I couldn't shake it. I tried to push it away. Who would do something like this? But the reservoir and bottle were fine the night before. I was sure of it. I decided to keep going. The trail was supposed to follow another stream a few miles ahead, and I figured I'd try again there. The hike felt different now. Every sound in the forest made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the trail stayed empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the second stream, I was sweating and lightheaded. I crouched by the water, my filter in hand, but I hesitated. The water looked fine, but what if it wasn't? What if the problem wasn't the water at all? I forced myself to filter some and took a small sip. It tasted normal, but I couldn't bring myself to drink more. The memory of the smell from my reservoir was still too strong. I filled my backup bottle and packed it away, deciding I'd only drink if I absolutely had to. I kept walking, trying to focus on the trail ahead and not the growing sense of dread in my chest. The trail started to climb, winding up a steep hill. I was struggling by then, my legs shaking from dehydration. I had to stop every few minutes to catch my breath. That's when I saw it. At the top of the hill, where the trail curved, there was a pile of rocks stacked in a way that wasn't natural. It was small, maybe a foot tall, but it stood out. I froze, staring at it. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in. Slowly, I walked closer. My mouth was dry, and not just from the lack of water. When I reached the rocks, I saw something sticking out from between them. A piece of paper, folded and tucked into the pile. I hesitated, my heart pounding, before pulling it out. The paper was damp and smudged, but I could still read the writing. Not safe. That was all it said. I dropped the paper and stumbled back, looking around wildly. The forest was silent, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I felt exposed, like whoever had left the note was watching me. My mind raced. Did they mean the water wasn't safe? Or was it something else? I didn't wait to find out. I started moving, faster now, even though my legs felt like they were going to give out. I don't know how long I walked like that, my head spinning and my throat burning. At some point, I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. By the time I reached the trailhead, I was barely holding it together. My car was the only one in the parking lot, just as it had been when I'd arrived. I climbed in and locked the doors, my hand shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. As I drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about the note or the water. I still don't know what happened out there, or who tampered with my supplies. All I know is that I've never felt safe in the woods since. It was late, and the rain hadn't let up for hours. The roads were nearly empty, just the occasional flash of headlights from passing cars. I was driving back from my sister's place, a good 2-hour drive from where I lived. I'd left later than I planned, and now it was almost midnight. The rain was coming down so hard that the wipers barely kept up, smearing water across the windshield more than clearing it. I was already tense, gripping the steering wheel tightly, trying to focus on the slick road ahead. I saw him just past the bend in the road. At first, it was just a blur, a figure standing on the shoulder, hunched against the rain. As I got closer, my headlights lit him up. He was soaked to the bone, wearing a dark jacket that clung to his frame, water dripping from his hair and face. His arm shot out, thumb extended, the universal signal for a hitchhiker. I don't know why I slowed down. Maybe it was the rain, or the fact that he looked miserable standing there in the middle of nowhere. Maybe it was guilt, thinking how I'd feel if I were stranded out here in weather like this. Either way, I pulled over. He jogged up to the car, water splashing around his boots. When I rolled down the window, he bent down, and I got my first good look at him. He looked to be in his late 30s, early 40s maybe. His face was pale, water streaming down his cheeks. His eyes were wide, almost too wide, and he was breathing hard like he'd been running. "Thanks, man," he said, his voice low but strained. "I've been out here for hours. You're a lifesaver." I hesitated for a moment, then unlocked the door. He climbed in quickly, shaking off the rain as best he could, though it didn't help much. The smell of wet clothes filled the car immediately. He shivered as he buckled himself in. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Just up the road," he said, pointing vaguely ahead. "Not far." I nodded and pulled back onto the road. The rain hammered against the roof, and the sound of the wipers filled the silence between us. I tried not to stare at him, but I couldn't help glancing over every few seconds. He sat stiffly, his hands resting on his knees, his head tilted slightly down. His jacket was zipped up tight, but something about the way he held himself made me uneasy. "You, got stuck out here?" I asked, trying to make conversation. "Car broke down," he said quickly. "Back there a ways." "Did you call someone?" He shook his head. "Phone's dead." I didn't push it. Something about his tone made me want to drop the subject. Instead, I focused on the road, though my grip on the wheel tightened. The minutes stretched on, and the tension in the car grew. He didn't say much, just stared straight ahead. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it, that he was just cold and tired. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. The way he sat, too still. The way his eyes darted to the rearview mirror every so often, like he was checking for something or someone. After a while, he shifted in his seat. I caught the movement out of the corner of my eye and glanced over. That's when I saw it, a handle sticking out from inside his jacket. At first, I thought maybe it was a tool, a flashlight or something. But then he adjusted his jacket, and I saw the glint of metal. A knife. A long one. My stomach dropped. I kept my face as neutral as I could, but inside, my mind was racing. Why was he carrying a knife? And why was he trying to hide it? I forced myself to stay calm, my hands steady on the wheel. I didn't want him to know I'd seen it. So, I said, keeping my tone light, how far did you say you needed to go? Just a bit further, he said, his voice low. I'll tell you where to stop. I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I needed a plan, but I couldn't think straight. The rain was still coming down hard, the road stretching endlessly ahead. There wasn't another car in sight. I couldn't pull over now with him sitting there, the knife hidden in his jacket. I couldn't speed up or swerve, he'd notice. Then he spoke again, and his voice sent a chill down my spine. You live around here? He asked, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. No, I lied quickly. Just passing through. He nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on me. You seem like a nice guy, he said. Not many people would stop for a stranger these days. I didn't respond. My throat felt dry, my pulse thundering in my ears. I focused on the road, hoping, praying for a sign of another car, a gas station, anything. But the road was dark and empty, just the endless rain and the shadows of trees on either side. He shifted again, and I felt the air in the car grow heavier. You ever wonder, he said suddenly, what you'd do if you were in the wrong place at the wrong time? The question hung in the air, cold and sharp. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The silence stretched on, and I realized I had to do something. I couldn't just keep driving, waiting for him to make a move. I glanced at the dashboard, pretending to check the fuel gauge. Damn, I muttered, loud enough for him to hear. I think I'm running low on gas. I might need to pull over soon. He didn't respond right away. When I glanced over, his eyes were on me, unblinking. There's a station up ahead, he said finally. Keep going. I nodded, my grip tightening on the wheel. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. If I could get to the station, maybe there'd be people there. Or at least a chance to get out of the car. But then he did something I didn't expect. He reached into his jacket, slowly, deliberately. My breath caught, my knuckles white on the wheel. But instead of pulling out the knife, he pulled out a phone. He held it up, tapping the screen a few times. The glow lit up his face, casting shadows across his sharp features. You said your phone was dead, I said before I could stop myself. He smiled, a cold, humorless smile. Guess I lied, he said. That was it. I couldn't wait any longer. I hit the brakes hard, the car skidding slightly on the wet road. What the hell are you doing? He shouted, but I didn't answer. As soon as the car stopped, I threw it into park and bolted up the door, rain pouring down on me as I ran. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. I just ran, the rain soaking through my clothes, my feet slipping on the wet pavement. I heard him shout behind me, the car door slamming, but I didn't dare turn around. I ran until I saw headlights in the distance, waving my arms frantically as a truck approached. The driver stopped, and I stumbled toward him, gasping for breath. "Help," I managed to say. "Someone's after me." The truck driver didn't ask questions. He let me climb in, and we sped off, leaving the car and the hitchhiker behind. I don't know what he wanted or what he planned to do, but I'm glad I didn't stick around to find out. The rain had started before I left the office, but I didn't think much of it. By the time I was halfway home, it was coming down in sheets, so heavy my wipers couldn't keep up. It was one of those back roads, winding and narrow, with no lights except for my own headlights cutting through the dark. I was going slower than usual, but the pavement was slick and the turns were sharp. I don't even remember what I hit. It could have been a branch or a patch of water pooling on the curve. My tires slid, and before I knew it, I was skidding off the road. The car slammed into something, maybe a tree, and came to a stop. My chest hurt from the seatbelt digging in, but I wasn't bleeding. I tried the engine, but it just sputtered. Dead. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was gone. It was too far out, too isolated. The rain was coming down so hard that staying in the car felt useless. I had seen a house just a little way back. I figured I could at least ask to use their phone. Leaving my car felt wrong, but what else could I do? I put up my hood and stepped out, the rain soaking through my shoes almost immediately. The house wasn't far, maybe a quarter-mile at most. It was big, an old farmhouse kind of place, sitting back from the road with a long gravel driveway. The lights were on inside, which made me think someone would help. I jogged up to the porch, trying to shake off the water before I knocked on the door. I waited, shivering. The rain made everything sound muffled, like the world had shrunk to just me in this house. No one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. A light flicked on upstairs, and I saw a shadow move behind the curtains. Someone was home. I knocked again and called out, "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down. I just need help." After a few seconds, I heard the lock turn, and the door opened just a crack. A man stood there, older, maybe in his late 60s, with thin hair and a lined face. He was holding the door with one hand, and the other was hidden behind it. His eyes were sharp, watching me closely. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. "My car's stuck down the road," I said. "It won't start, and I don't have a signal. I just need to use your phone, if that's okay." He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked me up and down. Then he nodded and opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the house smelled old, like wood and dust. The hallway was narrow, with faded wallpaper and a single bulb overhead casting long shadows. The man didn't speak as he shut the door behind me, and I noticed he slid the bolt across once it was closed. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just an old habit. "The phone's in the kitchen," he said, motioning down the hall. "You can use it." "Thank you," I said, trying to sound grateful. I followed him down the hall, my wet shoes squeaking on the floor. The kitchen was small, with a table in the corner and an old rotary phone mounted on the wall. I picked it up and listened for a dial tone, but there was nothing. "It's dead," I said, turning back to him. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "Storm must have knocked it out," he said. "Happens a lot out here." I didn't know what to say. I was stuck now, completely at his mercy. "Do you have a cell phone?" I asked, hoping he might have something newer. "Don't use them," he said flatly. "But you're welcome to wait here until the rain lets up. Maybe the phone will come back." I didn't have much choice, so I nodded. Thank you, I said again. He motioned to the table. Sit. I'll get you something warm. I sat down, the chair creaking under me. He moved to the stove, where a kettle was already sitting. I tried not to stare, but something about the way he moved felt off, like he was too deliberate, too careful. His hand shook a little as he poured the water, but his face stayed calm, almost blank. When he set the mug in front of me, I noticed his hand lingered on the edge of the table, just for a second. I looked down and saw faint scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged a knife across it over and over. My stomach tightened. You live here alone? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded. Been here all my life. Don't get many visitors. I sipped the tea, even though I wasn't thirsty. It was bitter, and I wondered if he added something to it. The thought made me feel stupid, paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. He was just standing there, watching me, not drinking anything himself. I should probably get back to my car, I said, setting the mug down. Maybe someone else will come by. His face hardened. You'll stay, he said. It's too dangerous out there. I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. I'll be fine, I said, standing up. Really, thank you for your help, but I don't want to bother you anymore. He stepped in front of me, blocking the door. You can't leave, he said, his voice colder now. Not yet. I glanced past him, toward the hallway. My heart was pounding. Why not? I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp, and he held it like he knew how to use it. Sit down, he said. I backed up, my mind racing. The window over the sink was small, but I thought I could fit through it if I had to. The rain was still pounding outside, and the glass was fogged up, but it was better than staying. I don't want trouble, I said. I just want to leave. He shook his head slowly. You shouldn't have come here. Before he could move, I grabbed the mug from the table and threw the hot tea at him. He screamed, clutching his face, and I bolted for the window. The latch was stiff, but I forced it open and scrambled through, landing hard in the mud outside. I ran, not looking back, slipping and stumbling in the rain. I could hear him shouting, but his voice faded as I put more distance between us. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept going until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, desperate, and the car slowed. A woman rolled down her window, looking concerned. Are you okay? She asked. Please, I said, breathless. I need help. There's a man back there, he has a knife. She unlocked the door, and I climbed in, shaking and soaked. She called the police as we drove away. I told them everything, but when they went to the house, it was empty. No sign of a man, no sign of anyone. I don't know where he went, but I still think about that night. About what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out. The rain started coming down just after I left the grocery store, heavier than I expected. I had planned to walk the 2 miles back home. It wasn't far, and I liked the fresh air, but this wasn't just a light drizzle. It was pouring, cold and relentless, soaking me through in minutes. I had no umbrella, just a bag of groceries I was now holding against my chest to keep dry. I hurried along the sidewalk, keeping my head down against the wind, when I saw the bus stop up ahead. It wasn't much, just a small glass shelter with a bench inside, but it would keep the rain off. I picked up my pace, my shoes squelching with every step, and ducked under the awning with a sigh of relief. The rain hammered against the roof and the glass walls, loud and unrelenting. I was about to set my bag down and check my phone when I noticed I wasn't alone. There was someone else there, sitting on the bench, a man. He looked up when I entered, his face partially hidden by the hood of his jacket. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with a blank expression. His clothes were wet, his jeans dark with rainwater, and his hands were shoved deep into his pockets. Something about the way he was sitting, hunched forward with his legs spread wide, made him seem bigger than he really was. I nodded to him, not sure what else to do, and stood off to the side, leaning against the glass. There wasn't much room under the awning, and I didn't want to crowd him. The rain was coming in sideways, though, and the wind kept blowing it against my legs. I shuffled closer to the center, trying to stay dry. He didn't move or look away, and I could feel his eyes on me as I adjusted my bag and wiped the water off my face. It was awkward, but I tried to ignore it. Maybe he was just tired or cold. We were both stuck here, after all, waiting for the rain to let up. After a few minutes, he spoke. "You live around here?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The question caught me off guard. It wasn't an unusual thing to ask, but there was something about the way he said it that made my stomach tighten. I hesitated before answering, keeping my voice casual. "Yeah, not far," I said. "Just waiting out the rain." He nodded slowly, like he was thinking about that. His eyes stayed on me, unblinking. I looked away, pretending to check my phone, but the screen was too wet to work. I shoved it back in my pocket and tried to focus on the rain instead of the strange tension in the air. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said after a long pause. I glanced at him, unsure if he was trying to be helpful or threatening. His tone was flat, hard to read. I forced a small smile, not wanting to make things worse. "It's just rain," I said. "I'll be fine." He didn't respond. Instead, he leaned back on the bench, stretching his legs out in front of him. His boots were caked with mud, leaving streaks on the floor. He was taking up most of the space now, and I could feel the cold spray of the rain against my back as I tried to stay out of his way. The silence stretched on, heavy and uncomfortable. I could feel my pulse quicken, the hairs on my neck standing up. There was something off about him, something I couldn't put into words. I thought about leaving, but the rain was still coming down hard, and I didn't want to get soaked again. Then he stood up. It wasn't a sudden movement, but it made me flinch anyway. He was taller than I'd realized, broad-shouldered and solid. He stepped closer, his hands still in his pockets, and I pressed myself against the glass, trying to keep some distance between us. "You're taking up a lot of room," he said, his voice sharper now. "I was here first." I blinked at him, confused. There was plenty of room in the shelter, enough for both of us. But the way he was looking at me, his eyes narrowing, made it clear he didn't want me there. "I'm not trying to bother you," I said carefully. "I'll stay over here." He didn't move, just stood there, blocking the exit. The rain was pouring behind him, a solid wall of water. My heart was racing now, and I could feel the panic building in my chest. "I think you should go," he said, his voice cold. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. I didn't want to escalate things, but I also didn't want to step out into the storm, leaving myself vulnerable. "Look, I'm just waiting for the rain to stop," I said. "I'll be gone as soon as it lets up." He didn't respond. Instead, he took another step closer, and I realized just how trapped I was. The shelter was small, the glass walls offering no escape. I could see the rainwater pooling at the edges, dripping onto the floor. "You don't belong here," he said, his voice low and menacing. I didn't know what he meant, but the way he said it sent a chill down my spine. My hands tightened around my bag, the only thing I had to defend myself with. "Please," I said, my voice shaking. "I don't want any trouble." He smirked at that, a cruel twist of his lips. "Trouble?" he said, his tone mocking. "You think I'm trouble?" Before I could respond, he lunged forward, grabbing my arm. His grip was strong, his fingers digging into my skin. I tried to pull away, but he held on tight, his face inches from mine. "You need to learn some respect," he hissed. I didn't think. I swung my bag at him, the weight of the groceries knocking him off balance. He stumbled back, letting go of my arm, and I took the opportunity to push past him, running out into the rain. The cold water hit me like a wall, but I didn't stop. I ran as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't look back, too afraid of what I might see. The rain blurred everything, the streetlights casting faint glows in the darkness. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, where cars were passing by, their headlights cutting through the storm. I flagged down a driver, my voice barely audible over the rain, and begged them to help. They let me in, and I explained what had happened as they drove me to safety. By the time the police arrived at the bus stop, the man was gone. I still don't know what he wanted or what he might have done if I hadn't fought back. But I can't forget the look in his eyes, the way he seemed to enjoy the fear he was causing. Now, every time it rains, I can't help but think about that night and wonder if he's still out there, waiting for someone else to cross his path. We decided to go hiking on a Friday. It was supposed to be a simple weekend trip, just 4 of us, me, Danny, Claire, and Joel. The trail was tucked deep in the woods, far from any towns or cell service. Joel picked it because it was supposed to have some amazing views, and we were all up for an adventure. We packed our gear, food, and tents, ready for 2 nights of camping. The first day was fine. The trail was narrow, winding through dense trees, with little clearings where we'd stop for water or a quick snack. We laughed, took pictures, and talked about how nice it was to be away from everything. Danny was the jokester of the group, always messing around and teasing Claire about her fear of bugs. By the time we made it to the first campsite, the sun was setting. We set up our tents, made a small fire, and ate while the sky turned dark. That night, as we sat around the fire, we thought we heard something in the woods. It was faint, like a twig snapping, but it made us all stop talking. Joel said it was probably an animal, maybe a deer. We laughed it off, but I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no crickets, just the occasional rustling of leaves. The next morning, Danny was gone. His sleeping bag was empty, his boots were gone, and so was his backpack. At first, we thought he'd just gone to use the bathroom or explore, but as the hours passed, we started to worry. Joel and I searched the area, calling his name, while Claire stayed by the camp in case he came back. There was no sign of him. No footprints, no gear left behind, nothing. By midday, Joel suggested we pack up and head back to the car. He said maybe Danny had gotten lost and somehow found his way back to the trailhead. Claire was panicking, saying we should call for help, but our phones didn't have any signal. We agreed to hike back, figuring we could alert someone once we were closer to town. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. The trail felt different on the way back, like the trees had closed in. Joel noticed it too. He kept checking the map, muttering that it didn't make sense. The path seemed longer, or maybe we were just more on edge. Then we found the first clue. A water bottle, half full, sitting on the edge of the trail. It was Danny's. He had a specific brand he always carried. Claire picked it up and started crying, saying he must have come this way. But why would he leave it behind? Joel tried to stay calm, saying it could have fallen out of his bag. An hour later, we found his bandana tied to a low branch. That was when Joel started to get nervous. "This isn't right," he said. He wouldn't just leave his stuff like this. We decided to keep moving, faster this time, but the trail seemed to stretch on forever. Around dusk, we found his boot. Just one, lying in the middle of the path. The laces were still tied, but it was dirty, like it had been dragged through the mud. Claire broke down again, saying we needed to stop and wait for Danny. Joel and I argued with her, saying it was safer to keep going. We didn't want to be stuck out there another night. That was when we noticed something. The boot had marks on it, like it had been scratched or clawed at. But they weren't from an animal. They were too deliberate, too clean. Joel and I exchanged a look but didn't say anything to Claire. We just told her to keep moving. As the sun went down, we found more clues. A ripped strap from Danny's backpack, a trail of granola spilling across the dirt. Each piece felt like a breadcrumb, like someone was leading us somewhere. I started to hear things, branches snapping, leaves rustling, but every time I turned, the woods were empty. Joel was tense, his hand gripping the strap of his pack like he was ready to swing it at someone. We decided to stop for the night when it got too dark to see. Claire was a mess, whispering that something was wrong, that we should have stayed at the first campsite. Joel tried to reassure her, but I could see the fear in his eyes. None of us slept. We just sat there, listening to the forest. Around midnight, I saw movement. Just a shadow, darting between the trees. I nudged Joel, and he saw it too. We didn't wake Claire, not wanting to scare her more, but we stayed up, gripping sticks like they were weapons. The shadow didn't come closer, but it didn't leave either. It just circled us, staying just out of reach. By dawn, we were ready to run. We packed up as quickly as we could, dragging Claire along as she sobbed. The trail was easier to follow in the daylight, but the woods felt wrong, like they were watching us. Then we found Danny's other boot. It was on the trail, facing us, like it had been placed there. Joel picked it up and froze. Inside was a piece of paper, folded tightly. He opened it, and his face went pale. I grabbed it from him and read the message. It was written in blocky, uneven letters, "You're next." That was it. We ran. We didn't care about staying quiet or conserving energy. We just ran, crashing through the underbrush when the trail twisted too much. I didn't look back, not even when I heard Claire scream. Joel stopped to help her up, but I kept going, yelling for them to hurry. We made it back to the car just as the sun was setting. The lot was empty, and Danny's car was still there, untouched. We piled into Joel's car and sped out of there, not saying a word until we hit the main road. We reported everything to the police, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Danny, no evidence on the trail. It was like he had vanished. They said it was probably an animal attack or that he'd gotten lost, but I know that's not true. Someone was out there, watching us, leading us, playing with us. And they're still out there. I was driving home late at night, a long stretch of highway that seemed endless. The gas light came on around 11:30 p.m., and I knew I had to stop. There wasn't much out there, just dark fields and the occasional distant farmhouse light. When I saw the sign for a gas station a few miles ahead, I felt relieved. The place looked run down when I pulled in. A single fluorescent bulb buzzed above the pumps, casting a weak light. There was an old pickup truck parked near the building, but I didn't see anyone around. The station itself was a small convenience store with large windows, though most of the shelves inside looked half empty. A man was sitting behind the counter, leaning back on a stool. I got out of the car and started pumping gas. The whole time, I felt uneasy. The air was too still, and the only sound was the faint hum of the pump. I tried to shake it off. It was late. I was tired, that was all. But then, as I was finishing up, I noticed a man behind the counter watching me. He hadn't moved, but his eyes were fixed on me, unblinking. When the pump clicked off, I went inside to pay. The door jingled when I pushed it open, and the man sat up a little straighter. He was middle-aged, with thinning hair and a stained shirt. His smile was too wide, too forced. "Evening," he said, his voice low and scratchy. "Hi," I replied, placing a 20 on the counter. "Pump 2. He didn't take the money right away. Instead, he glanced at the door, then back at me. "Travelin' late, huh?" "Yeah," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Just heading home." He nodded slowly, still not touching the money. "Not much traffic out this way at night." I didn't respond. His gaze was heavy, like he was sizing me up. Finally, he took the 20 and rang me up, but he was moving slower than anyone I'd ever seen. He pressed a few buttons on the register, then stopped, looking over his shoulder. "You need anything else?" "Snacks." "Coffee?" he asked. "No, I'm good. Just the gas." "You sure?" "We got fresh coffee in the back," he said, pointing vaguely toward a corner of the store. "I'm sure," I said, stepping back toward the door. He didn't like that. His smile faded, and his eyes narrowed slightly. "Wait here a minute," he said, reaching under the counter. My stomach dropped. I thought he was reaching for a weapon, but instead, he pulled out a cordless phone. He turned away from me and dialed a number, speaking quietly. I couldn't hear everything, but I caught enough to make my skin crawl. "She's here now," he said. There was a pause, then, "Yeah, just one. Car's outside." He glanced at me over his shoulder, his expression blank. I tried to act like I wasn't paying attention, but my hands were shaking. He hung up the phone and turned back to me, his smile back but tighter now. "Something wrong?" he asked, his tone almost mocking. "No," I said quickly. "I should get going." "Thanks." I started to back away, but he stepped out from behind the counter, blocking the door. He wasn't smiling anymore. "You should wait," he said. "You said you were tired, right? Could be dangerous driving like that." "I'm fine," I said, trying to sound firm. My heart was racing, and I knew I had to stay calm. He took another step closer, and I realized how much bigger he was than me. "No need to rush. Why don't you sit down for a bit? I got some chairs over there." He nodded toward a corner of the store, but I didn't even glance in that direction. "I really need to go," I said, edging toward the door. My hand brushed against a display of chips, and the crinkling sound seemed deafening in the silence. He didn't move for a moment, just stared at me like he was deciding something. Then, suddenly, the phone on the counter rang. The sharp sound made us both jump. He hesitated, then turned to answer it. "Yeah," he said into the receiver. His voice was low again, but I didn't wait to hear the rest. The moment his back was turned, I bolted. I shoved the door open so hard it hit the frame, the jingle of the bell ringing in my ears as I ran to my car. My hands fumbled with the keys, and I could hear the door of the station slam open behind me. "Hey," he shouted. I got the door unlocked and jumped in, slamming it shut just as he reached the car. He pounded on the window, yelling something I couldn't understand. My fingers shook as I turned the key, the engine roaring to life. I threw the car into reverse, nearly hitting the pump as I sped out of the lot. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing there, his face twisted in anger, watching me drive away. But then I saw something else. Another set of headlights appeared, coming down the road toward the station. A large truck, moving fast. It pulled into the lot just as I turned onto the highway. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit truck stop about 20 miles away. I parked near the entrance and locked all the doors, my hands still shaking. When I looked at my phone, I realized I hadn't even thought to call the police. I reported it later, gave them the address of the station and described the man. But when they went to check, they said the place was abandoned. The building was still there, but the pumps were dry and the store was empty. They said it hadn't been in business for years. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I'll never forget the look in his eyes. And I'll never stop at a gas station like that again. It was a little after midnight when I got to the gym. I had a long day at work, and I wanted to blow off some steam. The place was mostly empty, which wasn't unusual for that time. There was one guy on a treadmill when I arrived, but he left after about 20 minutes. By then, it was just me. I liked the quiet. I didn't have to wait for machines, and I didn't have to deal with anyone taking up space by scrolling on their phone. The gym wasn't huge, just a single floor with a weight section in one corner and cardio machines in another. The locker rooms were in the back, and there was a staff desk near the entrance. I did my usual routine, some bench presses, a bit of time on the rowing machine, and a lot of focus on the free weights. I lost track of time, like I always do. It was probably close to 2 a.m. when I decided to wrap up. My arms were sore, and I figured I'd done enough for the night. When I grabbed my water bottle and towel, I noticed the place was eerily quiet. More than usual. I hadn't seen the staff member in a while, but I didn't think much of it. Sometimes they'd step out for a smoke or to grab something from the back office. I walked to the front door, but when I pushed, it didn't budge. It was one of those heavy glass doors with a magnetic lock that needed a key card to open. I assumed my key card just hadn't scanned properly, so I swiped it again. The reader beeped, but the door stayed shut. I tried a few more times, each swipe followed by the same beep, but the lock didn't release. I looked around for the staff member, but the desk was empty. I knocked on the door in case they were outside. No one came. My phone was in my gym bag, so I pulled it out to call the number posted near the desk. It rang a few times, then went to voicemail. I hung up and tried again. Same thing. That's when I started feeling uneasy. I told myself it was a glitch. Maybe the system was down, and the staff had stepped out. I tried to stay calm. I figured I'd wait a bit and they'd come back. I sat on one of the benches near the free weights and scrolled through my phone to distract myself. That's when I heard it. It was faint at first, almost like I imagined it. A heavy breath, slow and deliberate. It came from somewhere near the back of the gym. I froze, straining my ears to listen. For a moment, there was nothing, just the hum of the air conditioning. Then it came again. Louder this time. I turned toward the sound, staring into the dark corner near the locker rooms. The lights in that area were dimmer than the rest of the gym, but I could just make out the shapes of the lockers and the doorway leading to the bathrooms. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. No answer. Just silence. I stood up, every muscle in my body tensed. I told myself it was probably just the air vents or something falling over in the locker room. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I took a few steps toward the back, my sneakers squeaking on the polished floor. Is someone there? I asked. This time, I heard movement. Footsteps. Slow and deliberate. They echoed through the empty gym, coming from the direction of the locker rooms. I backed up, my heart pounding in my chest. My eyes darted around, looking for something to defend myself with. The best I could find was one of the metal dumbbells. I grabbed it, the cold weight steadying my shaking hands. Who's there? I shouted, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The footsteps stopped. The silence was worse. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a staff member playing a prank. Maybe someone had snuck in and was messing with me. Or maybe it was something worse. I stayed frozen, staring at the dark corner. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A laugh. Low and quiet, almost a chuckle. It didn't sound right. There was no humor in it, just something wrong. I backed away, keeping the dumbbell raised in front of me. I'm calling the police, I said, my voice cracking. I pulled out my phone and dialed 911. The call connected, and I told the operator what was happening. They said they'd send someone, but it might take a while since I was in a more remote area of the city. I kept the operator on the line as I moved toward the front of the gym. I could still see the dark corner out of the corner of my eye, but whoever was there hadn't moved again. The operator told me to stay on the line and try to find a safe place to wait. The staff desk had a small storage cabinet underneath. I crouched down and wedged myself inside, trying to make as little noise as possible. I kept the phone pressed to my ear, whispering updates to the operator. Then the footsteps started again. Slow and steady, moving closer to the front of the gym. I clutched the dumbbell tighter, my breath shallow and fast. The operator was saying something, but I couldn't focus on the words. All I could hear was the sound of those steps. They stopped right in front of the desk. I held my breath, praying they wouldn't look down and see me. My pulse was so loud in my ears that I was sure they could hear it. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the footsteps moved away. They headed toward the glass doors. I peeked out from the cabinet, just enough to see a figure standing there. The light from the street lamps outside cast their shadow across the floor. They stood there for a moment, their back to me. Then they turned their heads slightly, like they were listening for something. I ducked back into the cabinet, squeezing my eyes shut. A loud bang echoed through the gym. I jumped, hitting my head on the top of the cabinet. It was the front door. The figure was slamming their shoulder against it, trying to break it open. I told the operator what was happening, my voice barely more than a whisper. They assured me the police were on their way. The banging stopped, and the silence was worse than the noise. I waited, every muscle in my body tensed. Then I heard the footsteps again, this time moving toward the weight section. The sound of sirens in the distance broke the silence. The figure froze, then bolted toward the back of the gym. I stayed in the cabinet until I heard the sound of voices calling out, telling me it was safe to come out. The police found no one in the gym. Whoever it was must have slipped out through an emergency exit before they arrived. They checked the security footage, but the cameras in the back corner had been tampered with. I haven't been back to that gym since. I canceled my membership the next day. Now, every time I hear footsteps behind me, I feel that same icy fear, like they're still there, just waiting.